This video is sponsored by Manta Sleep, the makers of the most comfortable sleep mask on the planet. Bring your Manta Sleep mask to your next purple light party and you'll experience 100% blackout. The good kind, and the eye cups are super deep, so there's never any pressure on your eyes, and it's engineered for all of you weird side sleepers. I have a couple of these myself, and I love them. I use them almost every night. Hey, look at this guy. Oh, he's tossed his mask in the air. Now, when you toss yours up, it won't come apart like this. This is just for visual effect to show you what happens when you breathe through your eyes? Hey, she's a good catcher. You can also adjust the eye cups themselves in case the position of your eyes changes frequently. And if you're one of those people that like to rock out while you sleep, don't worry. This mask will never slip or fall off. She is having so much fun, and he is so cool. Get 10% off your Manta Sleep mask by entering code GLITCH at checkout. The link is in the description of this video. Put that back on. Nothing is crazier than scuba divers. I mean that, I'm not joking. They are a different breed of people. However, nothing is more horrifying than scuba divers accidentally recording disasters while they're underwater. From a saturation diver becoming stranded at the bottom of the North Sea with no oxygen for nearly 30 minutes while rescue crews watched through a camera feed.
Sickness feeling in your stomach and seeing him lying there twitching away and not knowing if he was okay or not. It was probably one of the worst experiences of my life.
To commercial divers trapped alive inside an underwater pipeline after a violent Delta P accident while their banging could still be heard from inside the pipe. And fun fact about me, I don't know how to swim. I've just never lived in an area where that was a requirement. I get a little bit freaked out in the pool when the water starts, getting up to my chin. So I just want you to know that as I'm telling you these stories, I am internally freaking out. And I know you're about to go diving this summer too, so listen carefully because I just want you to be safe. These are scuba diving accidents that became terrifying to watch because the cameras captured the entire disaster as it was unfolding in real time. First up is Yuri Lipsky. He's a Russian diver who ignored experienced divers' warnings and descended by himself into the Blue Hole. It's a place also known within the diving community as the Diver's Cemetery, for taking over 100 lives. On April 28th in the year 2000, 22-year-old diving instructor Yuri Lipsky entered the Red Sea at Dahab, Egypt, with a helmet-mounted camera, extra weights on his belt, and a plan to film the dive into the Blue Hole. He never returned to the surface. However, the camera did. And what that camera recorded from that dive became one of the most disturbing pieces of underwater footage that's ever been recovered. Yuri Lipsky was a Russian-Israeli instructor with formal training. He wasn't this amateur diver by any stretch of the imagination. He had come to Dahab with one specific goal, and that was to document the Blue Hole. It's a world-famous dive site on the Sinai Peninsula. From the surface, the Blue Hole looks like a dark, circular opening in the reef that's surrounded by shallow coral waters. It attracts divers from all over the world. It's beautiful. Below the surface, though, it drops into a vertical sinkhole that reaches extreme depths far beyond recreational limits. The structure descends past 130 meters with a steep underwater cliff that leads into depth that exceeds 1,000 meters. The recovery of bodies is not always possible down there, and many remain inside the Blue Hole permanently. Local estimates place the death toll between 130 and 200 divers. It's widely referred to as, by divers as the Diver's Cemetery. Before the dive, Yuri spent the dive in Dahab trying to find a partner, somebody to take this dive on with him. However, every experienced technical diver told him no. The dive required specialized training, staged decompression, and proper gas mixtures for that extreme depth, and he didn't have any of those things. He eventually met Tarek Omar. Omar is a veteran technical diver that's known for recovering bodies from the Blue Hole. Omar had a conversation with Yuri and looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Do not do this dive." But Yuri did anyway. A little after 5 p.m., Yuri enters the water alone. Yuri was very heavily equipped. He was carrying about 12 kilos of lead weight on his belt. I think my quick math says that's like 25 pounds. Combined with standard gear and a 12-liter air tank, he was already dangerously, negatively buoyant before reaching depth. That's just a polite way of saying the dude was a sinking rock, pretty much. He also had no secondary air supply. Within minutes of descending, pressure begins to increase quickly. At depth, every breath becomes harder and more dense, and nitrogen absorption into the bloodstream also accelerates. Both of these things are bad. I don't need to tell you that. Beyond certain levels, divers can experience something called nitrogen narcosis, which is essentially a condition that impairs judgment and motor control. It's like you're drunk and underwater. It is insane, dude. I don't recommend.
It's like overdose of oxygen. So you stop breathing. While you are stop breathing, you already went unconscious.
Recreational diving limits set about 40 meters as the maximum depth that's considered safe, and Yuri passes that. He passes 50 meters. He eventually hits 60 meters. Now, as he's increasing his depth, he loses control of his descent, and his buoyancy control device was unable to counteract all of his excess weight, and the pressure that was surrounding him continues to increase, compressing his suit and his equipment while reducing his ability to stabilize himself. By the time he hits 80 meters underwater, which is double the maximum safe depth, he's officially in an uncontrolled descent. He attempted to inflate his buoyancy device, but it fails. That thing just rips open and it's completely useless now. It let all of the air out in one go. At just over 91 meters now, Yuri Lipsky hits the bottom of the blue hole face down. At 5:11 p.m., we can see his camera stop recording. The descent had taken approximately 7 minutes, and for an entire week, Yuri was stuck to the seabed. On May 5th, rescue diver Tarek Omar, remember him? The guy that told Yuri not to do this very crazy thing? Well, he goes into the blue hole after being contacted by Yuri's mother. She contacts Omar and she's freaked out. She says, "Yuri hasn't called me in a week. I'm very scared. What happened?" Well, Omar knows exactly what happened, so he searches the site and he actually locates Yuri exactly where he expects to find him. And Yuri was lying motionless on the bottom. The recovery confirmed that Yuri had died long before the official search began.
He was facing the ground. He have a cut on his tank strap, so the tank it was floating. His camera video, it was underneath him, around his chest, and he have couple of batteries around him. Next morning we went. It was a successful mission, and we got Yuri back to his mom and dad. But it was hard. It was tough.
Well, Omar retrieves Yuri's body, and then Omar goes back in for a second time to get his equipment, including the camera on his helmet. It was assumed to be destroyed because it had exceeded its rated depth limit of 75 meters. However, it was not. Later inspection revealed that the footage was intact and fully functional. Omar reportedly stated that if he had known the camera had survived, he would have destroyed it due to the psychological impact of what was on that camera. But since he wasn't aware of that, it was returned along with all of Yuri's personal belongings to Yuri's family, and eventually the footage surfaces online. It shows the final minutes of Yuri's uncontrolled descent, including rapid depth loss, visible disorientation, and the final impact with the seabed. At depth, the water shifts into this dark, reddish-bluish haze due to the light absorption, and sediment bursts outward at the moment of impact. It truly is hard to watch. The recording continues briefly after the fall before it eventually stops. If you go to visit the Blue Hole today, you'll see memorial plaques that mark the names of divers who never made it back, and one of those reads, Yuri Lipsky, 1977 to 2000. Ugh. And that's not even the worst of it, dude. I've got 2 more to tell you still, and they're even more disturbing. Let's dive in. Actually, that's poor choice of words, sorry. Let's use the little ladder around the edge of the pool to gently walk ourselves in backwards into these next two. While our buddy Yuri was completely alone in the blue hole, a far more disturbing incident was unfolding elsewhere. 5 pariah pipeline workers were suddenly sucked into a pipe that they had been working on just like any other day. They were trapped inside an underwater system that turned into a sealed death tunnel within seconds. On February 25th of 2022, 5 commercial divers traveled off the coast of Trinidad for what was supposed to be a routine underwater maintenance job. The men were Christopher Boudreau, Kazim Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, Faisal Kurban, and Rishi Nagasar. They were all very experienced divers, and they were all working on an underwater oil pipeline that was operated by Pariah Fuel Trading Company near Point Apierre. Their task that afternoon involved repairing part of the pipeline from inside a hyperbaric chamber, which is a pressurized water workspace that's used during deep-sea commercial diving operations. Part of the repair required removing an inflatable plug that sealed the inside of the pipe. Now, what the divers allegedly didn't know was that the other side of that plug had become dangerously unstable. The pipeline had been drained weeks earlier, and that created an extreme pressure imbalance inside the line. In diving, this phenomenon is known as delta P, or differential pressure. So when two connected spaces contain drastically different pressure levels, the force created between them can become incredibly violent. At around 3 p.m. that day, the divers began loosening the plug, but the second that it gave way, seawater exploded into the chamber, and the force instantly created this vortex that was powerful enough to drag the divers directly into the pipeline itself. Reports would later estimate that that pull carried nearly 7 tons. That's 14,000 pounds of pressure just yoinking on those guys. Within seconds, all 5 men were sucked through the pipe into complete darkness. One survivor later described it as feeling like a tornado underwater. The divers were slammed back and forth into the metal walls while being thrown uncontrollably through the pipeline at terrifying speed. Oil residue was burning their eyes, and hydrocarbon fumes were filling the air around them as they struggled to understand what was even going on. And then suddenly, in the middle of all of that panic and chaos, everything just stopped. Against all odds, the men had survived the initial accident, and the divers found themselves trapped inside a 30-inch pipeline roughly 16 meters underwater with no communication to the surface, and no idea how far they had traveled inside the system. The conditions inside the pipe would quickly become even more horrifying. Some sections were partially flooded, while toxic fumes filled the remaining air pockets. Several of the men had injuries from being hurled through the pipeline during the Delta P event. In some areas, the space between the water level and the roof of the pipe was only a few inches high.
Kaz, everything alright with you? No. Any limbs break? Oh, your leg, alright. Yusuf, anything happened to you? Yeah, boy. What happened? Alright.
At one point, Christopher Boudreau decided to move ahead alone while the others stayed behind, sharing what breathable air remained. The group hoped that he could locate another exit point or find a rescuer somewhere further down the line. So Christopher continues crawling down the pipeline by himself in total darkness. At times, the pipe flooded completely, which would force him to swim underwater through the tunnel without knowing where he was going. His oxygen supply eventually ran low, and according to later accounts, he genuinely believed that he was about to die inside the pipeline. And then, while moving through the darkness, his hand strikes another oxygen tank. So he grabs it and he keeps going. Hours after the accident, Christopher eventually surfaced near another section of the system and managed to signal for help by banging against the walls of the pipe. At around 6 p.m., he was finally pulled out alive. Covered in oil and barely conscious, Christopher immediately tells all of his rescuers and everybody around that the other 4 men were still down there and they were still trapped and they were still alive. Because they were. Throughout the evening, people on the surface reportedly would hear banging coming from inside the pipeline. The trapped divers were still knocking on the walls. Commercial divers and volunteers were reportedly prepared to enter the pipe and attempt to do a rescue operation almost immediately, and even other later accounts would say that family members of the trapped men wanted to go help too. But according to testimony during a later inquiry, officials decided that the situation was too dangerous because of the risk of another Delta P incident, and because of that, no rescue divers were sent in. As the hours passed, the banging allegedly continues from inside the pipeline, while families gather outside of the pipeline and the refinery just waiting for any sort of update. Even Chris himself wanted to go back down there and help his co-workers, but the company just would not let him.
I tell him, I say, boy, them fellas in there, let's go and save them, let's go and save them. And he was like, all right, but you relax. I said, don't tell me to relax. What better, let me go back and save them and I'll be...
The men trapped underwater were still alive, somewhere inside the darkness down there, and finally, after more than 13 hours, officials approved a new plan to access the pipeline from another section that was closer to shore. But by then, the pressure conditions inside the line had drastically changed. When part of the pipeline was opened, the pressure holding several air pockets stable reportedly collapsed almost immediately. Water rushed through the system, flooding the remaining spaces where the divers may still have been alive and breathing. Whatever chance remained disappeared within those seconds. Kaleem Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, Faisal Kurban, and Rishi Nagasar all died inside that pipeline. Autopsies would later suggest that some of the men survived far longer than we initially believed. Reports from the inquiry indicated that at least some of the divers were still alive many hours after the original Delta P accident. The aftermath only intensified public outrage, and I don't think I blame them. It was well aware to the public that everyone knew that there was men down there that were trapped and alive at least for some time, and there were plenty of rescue teams and volunteers that were ready to jump down there and save those people, but they were being roadblocked at every attempt. A government commission of inquiry later concluded that there was no proper rescue plan in place for an emergency like this. During testimony, company officials reportedly argued that attempting a rescue could have created additional danger for the other divers. One moment from the inquiry became especially infamous. A commissioner asked a manager how he believed the incident had been handled, and the manager responded with one word: excellent. What an absolute buffoon, what an outrageous answer that is to give. 4 men had died, being trapped alive inside an underwater pipeline after, surviving the initial accident for hours, and that was the word that was used to describe the response. Even years later, the Pariah diving incident is still one of the most disturbing industrial diving disasters that's ever been documented. Because the men inside the pipeline were alive well after it happened. They were banging on the walls for hours, waiting for somebody to come get them. And then comes the most disturbing, most unbelievable, and yet miraculous cases of all. I'm not even gonna cold intro this one, we're just gonna jump right in. On September 18th of 2012, commercial diver Chris Lemons prepared to descend nearly 300 feet below the surface of the North Sea. The job itself was nothing unusual. Chris was part of a saturation diving team that was responsible for maintaining underwater oil pipelines that were more than 120 miles off the coast of Aberdeen in northeast Scotland. It was dangerous work, of course, but it was still routine for divers like Chris, who spent weeks at a time living inside pressurized chambers aboard massive support vessels.
Yeah, we live in a chamber on the ships. There's 12 of us living there, and we work in teams of 3. And because of the depth we work at, it does take 4 or 5 days to decompress. So that's obviously not feasible on a daily basis.
Before leaving for the job, Chris reassured his fiancée, like he always had to before he would go on a trip like this. He said there was no reason to worry. Within hours, though, he would be stranded alone on the seabed in complete darkness with no oxygen supply, no heat, and no chance of survival. At the time, Chris had been working as a saturation diver for about a year and a half. The job paid very well, as it should, it's dangerous work, and he and his fiancée were preparing for their wedding the following year, while they were also building a home overlooking the sea. But saturation diving came with some serious risks. Unlike regular scuba divers, saturation divers live inside a highly pressurized chamber for days or even weeks at a time. The pressure allows them to work safely at extreme depths without repeatedly decompressing after every dive. Now, for this particular operation, Chris was working on the diving support vessel called Topaz, alongside fellow divers Duncan Alcock and David Uasa. Just before 9 p.m., Chris and David entered the diving bell and began descending toward the seabed, while Duncan remained inside the bell monitoring their systems. Once they reached depth, Chris and David exited the bell and they began repairing pipework on a massive underwater structure known as a manifold. And each of the divers were connected to the bell through an umbilical cord. It's kind of like this lifeline, like this really thick rope. I don't need to tell you what an umbilical cord is, I'm sure you know. These thick lifelines also carried everything that would keep the divers alive, things like oxygen, communications, power for lights and for cameras, and hot water, which was used to stop the freezing seawater from shutting their bodies down. Without that umbilical, a diver would only have a tiny emergency oxygen supply which would last about a matter of minutes. At first, the job went off without a hitch, nothing to freak out about. But then, an alarm suddenly sounded aboard the Topaz. The ship's dynamic positioning system was going offline. Now, normally, the vessel used computer-controlled, softwares to stay perfectly above the dive site despite rough ocean conditions. This prevented them from being blown around one way or the other and losing sight of the divers. But now that system was offline and the ship had begun to drift across the North Sea.
So essentially the ship above us has a computer system which holds it in one place.
Yeah.
And that had a sort of catastrophic failure and exacerbated by the wind had started moving away in an uncontrolled fashion, and that was dragging us because we're connected to all of this by an umbilical, which is literally what it says.
That immediately creates a terrifying problem underwater. And as the vessel was being floated off this way, it was dragging the divers behind through their umbilical cords. Dive supervisor Craig Frederick ordered the divers to stop work and to return to the bell immediately.
Once I'd sort of recovered and stopped panicking and it dawned on me that the diving bell wasn't there, there was no route to safety, there was essentially no way of saving myself.
Chris and David began climbing back across the structure, while Duncan, still inside, tried feeding additional slack into their lines from inside the bell. But as Chris moved upwards, his umbilical became snagged around part of the metal structure, and the drifting ship just kept pulling. Chris tried desperately to free the line, but every second the tension was only growing worse. Back inside the bell, Duncan could see the umbilical pulling so hard and so tight that parts of the structure itself were beginning to bend.
I was hoping I was pulling Chris in.
And then, everything at once just failed. First, the air hose ruptured, and then the communications line went dead, and Chris instinctively switched to the small emergency oxygen tank that was attached to the back of his suit. Seconds later, the entire umbilical snaps. Black.
Hot water hose came in first. Broken and tattered at the end. And I had another couple of wraps of umbilical to pull in before a broken end of his gas hose came in.
Suddenly, Chris was alone at the bottom of the North Sea. His lights were gone, his communications were gone, and the hot water heating his suit had disappeared instantly, leaving him exposed to near freezing temperatures in complete darkness roughly 300 feet underwater. And his emergency oxygen supply only carried enough air for a few minutes.
And then very quickly after that, the gas hose stretched to the point that it wasn't allowing gas to pass, so I quickly had nothing to breathe. Very soon after that, the tension became so great on the umbilical that it snapped with like a shotgun going off, really. And I fell down to the seabed, and in the most absolute darkness.
As the ship drifted farther away overhead, Chris is trying to find that metal structure again in the complete darkness. He figures that if rescuers did return, then climbing onto the steel manifold would give them the best chance of locating him before his oxygen runs out.
And so he's going to go through the whole range of fight or flight reflexes. His heart's going to be pounding. He's going to be breathing harder than usual.
But he couldn't see anything. The seabed around him was completely black. At one point, Chris would later admit that he had no idea whether he was walking towards safety or farther into the empty ocean, and then suddenly his hands touched metal.
But also you can see all this twitching and movement and the unnatural way my hands and legs are moving.
He had found it. He found the structure that he was looking for in the complete darkness. Chris was able to climb onto this manifold and hold on to the platform as tightly as he could while the current moved around him in the darkness. Meanwhile, above him, the crew aboard the Topaz struggled to manually regain control of the drifting vessel. Without the positioning system, the ship had drifted hundreds of feet away from the dive site. At the same time, an underwater remotely operated vehicle was sent down to search for Chris, and the camera eventually located him lying motionless on the structure. By then, roughly 16 minutes had passed since the umbilical snapped, and since his emergency air supply was only enough to last a few minutes, everyone assumed he was already dead. Eventually, the crew managed to restart the positioning system and then guide the vessel back over to the dive site.
Good positive feedback from Craig from the surface saying that we were obviously going into a rescue mode. We were going back to fetch Chris. At no point did he say recovery.
Now, fortunately, David Uwasa, the second guy that went down with Chris, he was able to make his way back to the vessel because his umbilical didn't snap. Now, he jumps back into the water for a second time and he's descending and he's going to go get Chris. David reaches him, but Chris is unconscious. There was water inside his helmet. David clipped Chris to his rescue line and then dragged him back toward the diving bell. And by the time Chris was finally pulled inside and into safety, nearly 30 minutes had passed without oxygen. Duncan removed Chris's helmet and he immediately realized just how horrifying the situation was. Chris was blue. His eyes were closed. There was no reason to believe that he could still survive what he just went through. But even still, Duncan begins CPR. And then something unbelievable happens. After just 2 rescue breaths, Chris suddenly inhales. His eyes open, and against all odds, Chris is alive.
I asked Craig to get my umbilical pulled up as tight as I could, and I started climbing my umbilical, dragging Chris below and behind me.
Even more shocking than that, doctors later discovered that he had survived the entire ordeal without receiving any serious brain damage. Even now, to this day, years later, nobody understands how Chris was able to do that. Some experts believe that the oxygen-rich gas mixture used during saturation diving may have delayed the effects of the oxygen deprivation, but others think that the freezing water simply slowed down his body enough to protect his brain. Whatever the reason was, Chris Lemons survived something that definitely should have killed him within minutes. And incredibly, just weeks later, Chris returns to the North Sea and he continues diving, much to the dismay of his fiancée. His story later inspired the documentary and film called Last Breath, which recreated one of the most terrifying underwater survival stories that's ever been recorded. Because for nearly half of an hour, Chris Lemons sat alone in complete darkness at the bottom of the ocean with no oxygen. And with no explanation, he manages to survive the whole thing. I wanted to end this video on a somewhat positive note. I know the first 2 were pretty grisly, and the third one had every reason to be just as grisly, maybe even more so. But, somehow he survived, man, and I think that's pretty cool. Here's the thing about Coda that you need to understand before any of this makes sense. Coda is a creature of a habit. She's a scheduler. She's the girl who had her entire Monday mapped out to the minute, and I mean that literally. She knew that her girlfriend left for class at exactly 2:50 in the afternoon. She knew that she herself walked out the door at 3:55, and she knew that her bus pulled up at 4:04 every Monday. And she also knew that she'd be on campus by 4:20. See, before Coda leaves for class, every Monday she sets 3 alarms on her phone, one at 3:45, one at 3:50, and then another one at 3:55. That's the one where she needs to be out the door. This was the rhythm of Coda's life, and she and her girlfriend almost never broke it because breaking it meant missing class, and missing class was not something that Coda did. So on this particular Monday, last April, everything started just perfectly normal. She kisses her girlfriend goodbye at 2:50, she watches her head off to class, and then she settles in. She eats some lunch, she cracks open her notes to study for a test, and her alarm started going off just like clockwork. And at 3:55 on the dot, Coda grabs her stuff and she walks out the door. She gets to the bus stop, and there's this girl. It's a girl from the very class that Coda is going to, and she's standing there like she always is every single Monday. And Coda barely thinks twice about this. She gets on the bus, she finds her seat, and then the bus rolls towards campus, just like always. Except, when they pull up to campus, that girl from her class, she doesn't get off the bus, she just stays seated. Coda notices this, but she shrugs it off. It's none of her business, right? So Coda walks into the building, she steps into the elevator, and then she looks down at her phone, and the time says 3:10. Now, I want you to stop and feel what Coda felt in that elevator, because to her, it felt like the floor had just dropped out from under her. She had said goodbye to her girlfriend at 2:50. She ate lunch, she studied, and she waited for her alarms to go off at 3:55. There's not a version of any reality, not one, where all of that happens and she still makes it to campus at 3:10. And just to seal this completely shut, there is no bus that runs between 2:50 and 3:10 other than the one that her girlfriend was on. Coda calls her girlfriend immediately and she doesn't get an answer. Her phone is tucked away because she's in class. So, Coda does the only thing that a person can do when they think they've just slipped through a crack in the universe, and she takes a screenshot on her phone. It's got the date, the timestamp, everything. Now, while I was asking Coda if I could read this story for you now, I also asked if she had the screenshot on her phone to send to me, but unfortunately she did not. Now, in the moment, Coda took that screenshot because even in the complete fog of disorientation, she knew that she was going to need proof. Proof for other people, maybe even proof for herself. Her girlfriend eventually sees the multiple missed calls, she checks her messages after class, and yeah, she had no explanation either. And then, as if the universe wanted to make absolutely sure that Coda felt the full weight of what had happened, at 3:55 that afternoon, her alarm goes off again. The alarm that she had already left the house in response to. It rang for a second time, right on schedule, in some weird timeline that had somehow lapped itself. She went to class, she sat down, and when the actual scheduled version of class began, that girl from the bus walked through the door and took her seat just like nothing had happened. Coda had been turning this over in her mind for over a year at this point, and thankfully she's practical enough to acknowledge that sure, buses run late, they also run early, clocks can glitch, phones can do weird things, she's not dismissing any of that, but what she keeps coming back to is the thing that none of those explanations can even touch. There is no version of that afternoon where she did everything that she did and still arrived when she arrived. The math simply does not work. So she's left with the thing that she can't quite bring herself to fully say out loud. And that's the thought that lives in the back of her head whenever her favorite food tastes different, or her friends remember a shared memory just slightly differently than she does. And that is that somewhere between 3:55 and wherever she ended up, something happened to her on that bus. Something ended. And Coda's convinced now that whatever she's walking around in now, whatever timeline she happens to have stepped into when those elevator doors opened, it isn't quite the one that she started in that morning. Okay, so I need you to stay with me on this one because I've been turning it over in my head since I first read it, and I still get a little, I don't know, just stay with me. It's a Friday night in Sao Paulo, Brazil. It's October. The neighborhood is Largo de Santa Cecilia, and if you've never been, just picture this. It's a town square that lives and breathes. People are pouring in, samba music is leaking out of every doorway, and the air is thick and warm. It smells like beer in October, and the whole place is just pulsing. That is Sao Paulo on a Friday. So you've got these two cousins, Elio and Rodrigo. These are guys that grew up together, but they drifted into separate lives as they both matured, and they found a table together at the edge of all of that noise. It's close enough to feel the livelihood of Sao Paulo in the square, but still far enough that they can actually hear each other and actually have a conversation. And they've been sitting there for about 3 hours. They've got 2 beers each and a plate of chicken that got cold because neither of them wanted to stop talking and catching up. They went on and on. They were just yapping. They had no agenda. They were just following the threads wherever they went. Now it's nearly 11:30 and it's time to go. But first, bathrooms. The bar right in front of them is packed. It's shoulder to shoulder. The music is loud, so they look next door instead. The door is open and the lights are on, and they just walk in, but there's nobody inside. Now, remember this part. It's not like the place looks closed or anything. It's not dark. It's not being cleaned. You know, the lights are still on. The bottles are still lined up behind the bar, and most of the bar stools are pulled halfway out, like someone had just gotten up 30 seconds ago. The place is set up and it's running. It's just nobody's there. Not a customer or a bartender, not a soul in sight. Elio now has that feeling that you get when you walk into the wrong room at a party. Like you know you're not really supposed to be there. Something's just a little bit off. But there's nothing really to say about it, so they don't say anything. They just walk to the back of this area and they use the bathroom. It's a small bathroom. There's 2 stalls with 2 sinks. Rodrigo takes the first and Elio takes the second. And while Elio is in there, he hears this rhythmic knocking on the partition between them. Just this thunk, thunk, thunk. It's very slow, it's very steady. It's kind of like someone is shifting their weight. He figures that Rodrigo is just leaning against the divider, and he doesn't think any more about it. Elio comes out, he washes his hands, and the stall next to his is open. It's empty. And there's a man at the sink, and it's not Rodrigo, it's a stranger. He's somewhere between 50 and 60 years old. He's got this very weathered and very serious face, and he and Elio do the polite bathroom thing, you know, where you both just kind of pretend the other one's not there. But then Elio looks, and he doesn't know why. It's just one of those odd moments where something just pulls your eyes to a certain spot, you know? And he looks at the man, and the man looks back, and there is no reaction from this dude. He's just got this blank, you know, this almost imperceptible glance on his face. And then the man looks back, he finishes drying his hands, and then he leaves. Elio glances back at the first stall, the one that Rodrigo jumped in, and it's still empty, so he figures Rodrigo just finished early and then went outside. Elio dries his hands, he walks out through the empty bar, and he steps out onto the sidewalk outside, and he can't find Rodrigo anywhere. But then he notices the bag. The stranger that he just saw in the bathroom is a few feet away on the sidewalk, and he's now just standing there. Looks like he's waiting for something. And on his back is a green waste bag. It's the same shade of green and the same boxy shape that Rodrigo owns. That's actually Rodrigo's exact bag, Elio realizes. And now Elio is stunned. He's kind of paralyzed. He doesn't know what to do next. He tells himself that, okay, come on, dude. Coincidences exist. A green bag is not somebody's fingerprint, okay? You're just tired, and so on. But Elio looks at the man's face again, but this time the man turns and he meets his eyes again with that same total, bottomless reaction. So Elio starts moving. He circles the area, he's checking the square for Rodrigo, and he doubles back and he checks the sidewalk, and he finds nothing. He thinks, gosh, where could Rodrigo be? Maybe he's still in the bathroom, so he goes back into the empty bar and he's headed toward the back again, and then he feels his phone vibrate in his pocket. He pulls it out and takes a look at it, and it's Rodrigo. He's calling him. So Elio answers, and then he turns around as he does so to look through the open front of the bar out of the sidewalk, and Rodrigo is now standing exactly where the stranger was standing, wearing his green bag in the same position that the stranger was. They lock eyes, and Elio won't take his eyes off of Rodrigo while he's still holding the phone to his head and walking outside to meet him. And before either of them could either form the question fully, they ask it at the exact same time, almost word for word. They say, "What the hell just happened?" Now, Rodrigo's version of all of this goes like this. He wasn't knocking on the partition. He actually did finish quickly, and then he walked out of the bathroom. And then he stood in that empty bar for what he estimates to be over 10 minutes, just waiting for Elio to be done and then to come out. He's wondering what's taking so long, and while he's standing there, a man walks out of the restroom. And Rodrigo, which this is an important detail by the way, is not superstitious. He takes one look at this man and he can just tell that something is not right. He doesn't know what's wrong exactly. He doesn't feel fear or anything. He can just tell that something is wrong. Like the man's face is wrong. It's almost deformed in a way that Rodrigo struggles for weeks to even describe. And coming off of this man is something that Rodrigo can only call a heavy weight. Like he can feel the malice coming off of this dude. And this man, this very wrong man, is wearing a black t-shirt, and it looks a lot like the black t-shirt that Elio has been wearing all night. Rodrigo follows his dude outside of the bar, but he keeps a little distance. He's just trying to make sense of what he's seeing, and then the figure walks out to the sidewalk and then just stops. This is when Rodrigo reaches for his phone, but he still doesn't take his eyes off of the man. And then the figure turns, and that's when Rodrigo realizes it's Elio. This person now has Elio's face and Elio's exact posture and every small, specific, and, unremarkable detail by which you can recognize somebody that you've known your whole life. Rodrigo calls him and Elio answers, and they're now staring at each other from across a few feet at the Sao Paulo sidewalk. Freaked out, they walk home together. The samba music fades behind them, one block at a time, and they talk because, that's just what they do. Because neither of them really knows how to be alone with something this weird. Who was that guy? Why did each of them think that it was the other one? Why did Rodrigo wait 10 minutes by himself in that empty bar while that same 10 minutes did not pass for Elio? Ever since that night, both Elio and Rodrigo have been racking their brains, trying to think of a single explanation that explains what each of them saw that night. But they still haven't found one. Now, if you ask me personally, one of my favorite kinds of glitch in the Matrix stories are driving glitches. I just love the idea of unknowingly gaining time or losing time, or what happened to our next person. We're going to name him Barry for anonymity's sake, but this is what he says. One night back in high school, I was out with some friends on a completely normal Friday night. The friend who was driving us was the one who drove all the time. His name was Marcus. He knew his way around town perfectly, and to be honest, so did the rest of us because, collectively we had all each moved into different areas of town or changed schools throughout our lives, and, we went places almost every day at some point. My point is, we all knew our way around this town. That night at almost midnight, we cruised around the basic neighborhoods. We were just burning time until we had to be home when suddenly we were lost. It wasn't like we took a wrong turn or anything or cut down some random alleyway. We were legitimately lost. We had no idea where we were. We found ourselves on this suburban street that we had no idea existed before this night. We didn't recognize any of the houses or the street names or anything, which already didn't make sense because we knew how to get pretty much everywhere and we knew what the entire town looks like. We got to the end of the block thinking that maybe we would recognize something off in the distance. We would turn the corner and we would spot something that we could use to reorientate ourselves and then be on our way. But from then on, it was just one completely random neighborhood after the other. The street that we kind of stuck to was on this slope, so we were just driving down this gentle incline. There were no street lights, which was one very weird thing, other than like the one dim lamp on one of the curbs and a few of the houses, coach lights and stuff. There was no light. And none of those things were any help when it came to actually shining a light, pun intended, on the situation. We could really only see the sidewalk and the front of the houses while we were cruising past them. Now, looking up, the sky was pitch black, and the only thing that we could see up there was just the one North Star, presumably, and a couple of other stars off in the distance. The blocks around this street didn't look familiar at all. The streets, including the street names, were completely random. They were either streets that we had never heard of, or streets with extremely generic names. Also, the area of these neighborhoods didn't even fit the vibe of the town. I hope you know what I mean when I say that. Normally when you grow up in an area, you kind of understand the vibe. Maybe it's the way the houses look, or the way the streets are oriented, or in some cases, even the street names are themed loosely around one idea. But this part of town, none of that was going on. It was almost liminal, like we were just looking at some design of the most generic, non-specific neighborhood that we'd ever been in. And we even joked about being lost too, and I can't really speak for the other guys, but for me personally, I was just laughing from being genuinely scared and being afraid that we were screwed, not knowing how we were going to get home. You could have told us that we had left town by accident, and I honestly would have believed it. Even though it is extremely obvious that when you leave my town, you know what happens, because it requires either taking a highway, which is a very specific long road leading to towns that are 30 minutes or more away, or going on one of the bridges that have multiple signs. Now, I can't tell you how, but eventually we all make it home. I don't know if Marcus saw something and just didn't point it out, off in the distance, that let him kind of readjust where he knew where we were or what. But after driving for what felt like hours, we finally did leave those neighborhoods, and we ended up in our own neighborhoods one by one while Marcus dropped us off. We all made it home safe and sound. Now, what's weird about all of this is that after this night, on multiple occasions, either me and one of my other friends, or even just me alone, I would go around town in the daytime and in the nighttime trying to take various turns and streets, just trying to uncover where we had gotten so absolutely lost from. I was trying to retrace our steps and end up in this random neighborhood that none of us recognized, but I couldn't do it. I never found that neighborhood. Even as an adult, when I go back to this town, which I still do on occasion because my parents live there and I like to visit, but even as an adult, man, I'm trying to find those neighborhoods again, and I just, for the life of me, have no idea where they are or how we ended up there. Do you think that we somehow left town on a little path and we just didn't realize? Do you think that we might have glitched into some other neighborhood? I'm curious. Let me know what you think. So, my mom was a nurse. She worked full-time, long shifts. She was always moving, and she was always doing something for someone else. And then one night, literally overnight, everything changed. She went from being completely fine to not being able to walk on her own. There were never any warning signs or any slow degradations. It was just a hard stop for her. They ran tests, and pretty quickly we got the diagnosis. And unfortunately, it was terminal. And that word, terminal, I think that hits the entire family all at once. Everyone's trying to process it, but nobody really knows how. So my partner and I, we make a pretty quick decision. We pack up our kids, all of our stuff, we put our lives on pause, and we move into my parents' house. It wasn't even really a discussion, honestly. It just felt like the only move that made sense. You just do that for family. Now, my mom, she was the cook in the family. She was amazing. She handled everything in the kitchen, all of the meals, the desserts. She hosted the holidays. If it came out of that house, then it came from her. My dad, so lucky, dude. He got to spend his entire married life eating her food. But While we were moving into my parents' house, my mom was still at the hospital being watched and cared for. And, about a month later, she dies. She never makes it back home. And after that, we still stayed in the house for a while because it just helped, being together with my family and my dad. Even in the middle of all of that grief, it just made things feel a little more okay. A few weeks after that, I'm in my mom's kitchen just prepping dinner. This is kind of the pattern that's befallen me. I make dinner most weeknights since mom's not here anymore, and I'm just trying to keep things moving. And out of nowhere, the entire kitchen is filled with the smell of apple pie. And I mean, it's strong, like fresh baked right out of the oven apple pie. So I open the oven to see what's in there, and I find myself just standing there with my head in the oven, trying to figure out where this apple pie smell is coming from. But there's nothing. There's no pie in the oven. There's no apples in the kitchen at all even. Nothing is being baked. I don't even have a candle or an air freshener going. I have no explanation for this. The smell is just omnipresent. It smells amazing, too. And then, almost immediately, I get this urge to make an apple pie. It's a real persistent feeling that I should be making one right this very second. It's overwhelming me, which is not something I would normally do on a random weeknight, but that feeling just wouldn't go away. So I text my partner and I ask him to grab some apples on the way home. I go digging through one of my mom's recipes. She left this little box of handwritten recipes that have been in the family for generations. And I find one for apple pie, and I just start baking. A few hours later, my dad comes home. He walks in and he sees the fresh apple pie sitting right there on the counter, and he gets emotional. Right away, he just stops. And he tells me that earlier in that day, he had been thinking about apple pie. He was thinking about it so much that he almost just instinctively and just out of muscle memory picked up his phone to call my mom and ask her to make one. But he told me that as he was reaching for the phone earlier in the day, reality hit again, and he just had to pause and realize that that can't happen. But even still, he gets to come home that night and there's an apple pie waiting for him. I don't know, man. I still get chills every time I tell that story, and for what it's worth, the pie turned out really good. February 13th, 2017, Delphi, Indiana, USA. It was a teacher development day, and because of that, there was no class that day. It's a mild winter afternoon in a small town in Indiana that most of America had never heard of, and most would soon never forget. At 1 p.m. that day, Kelsey German dropped her younger sister Libby and Libby's best friend Abby off at the trailhead at the Monon High Bridge Trail in Delphi, Indiana. It's a town of roughly 3,000 people. It's about 60 miles northwest of Indianapolis. Libby was 14 and Abby was 13. They were 8th graders and the best of friends, and they loved going on afternoon hikes on these school holidays, and they often posted to Snapchat. They told Kelsey that they'd meet her back at a pickup point in just a few hours, but they never showed up. The Monon High Bridge is an abandoned railroad bridge that spans Deer Creek, and it's surrounded by woods on both sides. Hikers use it as a trail destination. It's scenic and quiet, and it's the perfect place to spend the day off in a small Midwestern town. Libby called her father, Derek German, at 1:38 p.m., and that was the last time that anyone would hear either of the girls' voices. What the world wouldn't know for days is that Libby had pressed record on her phone. At 2:13 p.m., as the girls crossed the bridge on their way back, they noticed a man was walking behind them. He was wearing jeans and a dark blue utility jacket and a hat that was pulled low over his face. He was following them. And Libby, 14 years old, standing on a decaying railroad bridge in the middle of the woods, could tell that something was not right. Without making it obvious, she quietly pulls out her phone and she starts to film. The footage is 43 seconds long. It shows Abby walking ahead of the camera along the bridge's wooden beams, and in the background, out of focus but still unmistakably there, is a man that's following the girls. Libby's voice is trembling, and it already sounds like she already knows what's going to happen next.
See, this is the path that we go down. There's no path going there, so we have to go down here.
Those are the last words that either girl ever said on recording. As the girls step off the bridge and they try to figure out which path leads back, a male voice cuts through the audio. And yes, that's the voice of the man behind them. He's the one speaking, and he says, "Guys, down the hill."
Hi.
At 5:30 p.m., when the girls didn't show up at the meeting spot, their families reported them as missing. A massive community search launched immediately. Hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement would then flood the trail and the surrounding woods. They searched throughout the night and they found nothing. The next morning, Valentine's Day of February 14th, a volunteer searcher found the bodies of Libby German and Abby Williams in a wooded area half a mile from the Monon High Bridge across Deer Creek. The volunteer's name was Pat Brown, and he couldn't believe what he had just found.
The bodies of Abby Williams and Libby German. Brown cried to the jury in court, saying, "I thought they were mannequins at first, and I just said, we found them."
Some of their clothing was wet, and they had been murdered. The nature of their injuries was never fully disclosed to the public, but what was disclosed was this. Abby, in her final moments, had hidden Libby's phone from the killer, and she tucked it away where it wouldn't be found. This brave young 13-year-old girl dying in the woods made sure that the evidence survived, and it did. Investigators from Indiana State Police recovered the phone. Digital forensic examiner Brian Bunner extracted the footage 4 separate times between 2017 and 2019, and each time getting more data from the device. Within days of the murders, police released a grainy still image from the video. That was the photo of a man on the bridge, face partially obscured, walking behind the girls. They released the audio clip of him saying, "Down the hill," and the image went viral immediately. The man became known everywhere, known as simply Bridge Guy. For 5 years, Bridge Guy was unidentified. More than 42,000 tips poured in, and investigators would eventually release a second sketch. Then, another video clip in 2019 showed the suspect walking across the bridge with his hands in his pockets. Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter addressed the killer directly at a press conference, saying, "We believe that you are hiding in plain sight."
Directly to the killer, who may be in this room. We believe you are hiding in plain sight.
And he was right. Because in October of 2022, 5 years and 8 months after the murders, police arrested Richard Allen, a 50-year-old pharmacy technician who had worked at the CVS in Delphi. He had lived in the same town as Abby and Libby for his entire adult life. In 2017, he had even spoken to police voluntarily, telling investigators that he had been on the trail that day. He admitted being on the Monon High Bridge in the afternoon of February 13th, but he claimed he had never seen the girls. His own unspent bullet casing was later linked to the scene of the crime. At trial in October of 2024, jurors watched the full 43-second video in court, and they heard the audio, and they saw Bridge Guy on the screen. Prosecutor Nicholas McClelland told the court that Allen had pulled out a gun and ordered the girls to go down the hill. The jury convicted Richard Allen of 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of felony murder while kidnapping. In December of 2024, he was sentenced to 130 years in prison, 65 years for each girl, to be served consecutively. At sentencing, McClelland publicly thanked Libby German. He praised her for having the presence of mind at 14 years old on an abandoned bridge with a man following her to quietly pull out her phone and press record. He called the footage arguably the biggest piece of evidence that we had, and he praised Abby Williams for hiding it. The full 43-second video was publicly released in March of 2025 by an advocacy group. I hope you enjoy this topic of true scary wilderness stories. I even dressed up for the occasion. I've got my camouflage hat on. I've got 2 more stories to share with you now. October 29th, 2012, Provo Canyon, Utah, USA. 2 days before Halloween, a group of campers were set up near Squaw Peak in Little Rock Canyon Overlook in Provo Canyon, Utah. The man who was filming, who posted the video under the YouTube username BeardCard and declined to use his real name, said that they noticed some deer on a hill nearby and decided to hike up to get a closer look. With him were 4 other people. They were his wife and his 3 siblings. It was a family camping trip on a Monday evening in the mountains above one of the most recognizable cities in Utah. Nothing about it was unusual, and neither was it supposed to be frightening. They grabbed the camera and started walking up the hillside toward where the deer had been. Somewhere along the way, the deer were gone. They were replaced by something else moving in the brush about 50 feet ahead of them. It was something big and dark and low to the ground, and it was hunched into the undergrowth. They thought it was a bear.
I can't see it.
They had actually been standing there for a while watching it before anything changed. It wasn't moving toward them, and it didn't do anything alarming. It just stood there as it was being filmed until it finally stood up. The 4 individuals on this hiking trip now believed that they were in the presence of a Bigfoot. And if you're new to planet Earth, those who don't know what Bigfoot is, it's this legendary ape-like cryptid that's said to live in remote forests in North America, usually described as a large, hairy, human-shaped creature that leaves giant footprints, but has never been scientifically proven to exist. Anyway, the hikers got scared, and then they run away.
Let's go.
They later made a channel on YouTube and posted a video titled Provo Canyon Bigfoot Encounter. In the video's description, they write, "We ran straight to the car after this, leaving our tent and everything else behind. It's probably all still up there. The tent, the gear, all of it was left on that hillside in the dark because nobody in that group wanted to walk back up and collect those things. They drove home and they left everything behind." The video was uploaded to YouTube on October 30th, 2012, one day after the encounter, and within 1 week, it had generated over 7 million views, and by the time national media picked it up, it had gone fully international. The video went immediately to the experts. Video analysis and CGI expert Mitch Phillips told Ringside Report that he had ruled out a costume due to the muscle tone and what appeared to be real fur. He concluded that the creature was not another known animal and that there was no video trickery. His conclusion was, it's real. And he said this is a huge piece of evidence supporting the existence of Bigfoot, and he goes on to say, "I'm impressed." Other analysts were less certain though. The skeptic community pointed out that the creature is only in frame for a matter of seconds before the camera drops, which is not long enough to make any definitive determination. Some argued that the shape and movement were consistent with that of a black bear rising onto its hind legs, which is a behavior that bears do engage in when they're startled or when they're curious. And others pointed out that the bulk of the figure, even at 50 feet away, was inconsistent with any bear species native to Utah. No one has ever claimed responsibility for a hoax, no costume was ever produced, and no one in the group ever came forward to say that it was staged. The footage also has never technically been debunked. What do you think they saw in the woods that day? On the morning of July 23, 2018, 2 hikers named Nicholas Horton and Logan Buell were making their way through Noble's campground inside Big Cypress National Preserve in Okeechobee, Florida, when they came across a tent that was pitched deep in the preserve near mile marker 63 of Interstate 75. They stopped. Inside the tent was a man, and the man was lying completely still. His body had been reduced to almost nothing. He weighed only 83 pounds. He was so emaciated that investigators would later struggle to determine a cause of death. And beside him were all of his belongings: a backpack, some hiking gear, some food, and almost $4,000 in cash. There was no sign of a struggle and no sign of any animal attacks either, and no drugs or foul play of any kind. This was just a man who had somehow starved to death, surrounded by everything that he needed to survive. When investigators arrived and searched his belongings, they found nothing. There was no indication of any kind. His fingerprints didn't match anything in any government database. He had no tattoos, no medical implants, nothing that could tell them who he was, except for one thing. He had this long, old scar running across his stomach, which was a scar that nobody could explain.
There was nothing there with a name on it, no wallet, no credit cards, no photo ID. We don't really know who he is. How difficult is this going to be?
He was somewhere between 35 and 50 years old. He had gray hair and a beard, and he also had blue eyes and well-maintained teeth. The investigators from the Collier County Sheriff's Office started at square one, missing persons databases. And then they looked at dental records, and then they looked at fingerprints, and they didn't find anything. The man in the tent had no traceable footprint in any traceable system anywhere in the country. It seemed as if this individual had slipped through every net that was specifically designed to catch exactly this kind of case. And so detectives were forced to do something unusual. They posted a composite sketch to Facebook, and within minutes, the hiking community explodes. Dozens of photographs came in. Hikers from Virginia and Georgia and Alabama and Florida all came forward saying the same thing. They all claimed to know this man.
You know, people were throwing out ideas.
He was seen in Georgia, he was seen in North Carolina.
They said that they had camped with him. They said that they had walked trail miles with him.
I was shocked. Holy shit, like, look at this. This is the guy I camped with.
If you don't mind, can I take a picture? Smiled and clicked his picture.
They said that they had all shared fires and late-night conversations with this person, and he seemed very likable. But the one thing that all of these people had in common was that they didn't know his real name. They just called him Denim. It was a name that stuck because for the first 2 weeks in the Appalachian Trail, he was the only person that was hiking in blue jeans. Later, he started going by something else, a name that was pulled from a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy reference that he used in a gaming forum that he had once posted on. Mostly Harmless. Hikers who spent time with him described someone who was very quiet, someone who kept to himself, but also had this warm presence about him. He was someone who would sit by a campfire and just chat with anyone for hours about science fiction, about Doctor Who, about loneliness, dark times that he didn't really dwell on very much. But, Jennifer Vickers, who went by the trail name Obsidian, walked roughly 100 miles with him through Virginia. She only knew him as Denim. And when she later found out that his real name was Vance, she laughed to herself a little bit and said, I guess I just want to remember him the way I remember him. Every hostel that he registered at during his hike, he signed in under the name Ben Billamy. But there was no Ben Billamy in any system anywhere. That name was completely fictional. At this point, the internet took the case and just ran with it. Facebook groups formed overnight and Reddit threads filled with competing theories. A Wikipedia page appeared as well. Amateur investigators spread across multiple countries, collectively pouring thousands of hours into trying to identify one man who had walked into the woods and then seemingly just walked off the earth.
We take care of each other. The group blew up.
All of these different Americans were using the internet to do something good.
For 2.5 years, nobody would find anything. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, New York, a small one-bedroom apartment had been sitting completely silent since early 2018. The rent had gone unpaid for more than 6 months, and when the building's owner finally obtained a warrant to enter, the apartment looked as though the tenant had simply stepped out just for a moment. The owner later said that we had no idea what happened to him. It was like he just disappeared. The tenant's name was Vance John Rodriguez. He was born on February 25, 1976, in Lafayette Parish, Louisiana. He was 42 years old when he died. He had grown up with an abusive father, and at 15 years old, that long scar across his stomach had come from an attempt at, well, let's just say self-deletion. At 17, he was legally emancipated from his family. He taught himself to code without ever finishing college, and he built a genuine career as an IT professional in New York. His former roommate, Randall Godzo, described a man who had spent 18 hours a day in front of his computer, cycling through what those who loved him called outages, and he refused food and he refused any contact, and he was borderline unreachable by anyone. A close friend named Mary simply said, he wore his sadness like an extra layer of skin. After he was identified, former girlfriends would come forward with a much darker picture. One woman who had dated him for 5 years had previously written publicly about standing up to the monster that beat her emotionally and physically. When his identity was finally confirmed, her mother left a comment on the post saying, "This man was so abusive to my daughter that he changed her." The break finally came in December of 2020, as photos of Mostly Harmless continue to circulate online. A group of friends in Baton Rouge recognized the man in the images as Vance Rodriguez, and they contacted the Collier County Sheriff's Office. A former coworker came forward separately after seeing a 2019 bulletin that the agency had issued. The Sheriff's Office brought in Othram, a DNA forensics laboratory in Texas that specializes in solving cold cases through genealogy. Rodriguez's family agreed to provide a sample, which would lead Othram to make a positive identification. On January 13, 2021, Collier County Sheriff Kevin Rambosk announced publicly that Mostly Harmless was in fact Vance Rodriguez, an IT worker from Brooklyn, originally from Lafayette, Louisiana. 2.5 years after two hikers stumble across a tent in a Florida swamp, the man inside it finally had his name back. His cause of death was never officially determined, though, but he did have everything that he needed to survive, except a reason to. Vance Rodriguez walked away from his entire life, gave himself 3 different names on the trail, paid for everything in cash, and made sure that no piece of paper could ever lead anyone back to him. He was found and identified by strangers, and when his family was finally contacted for comment, his sister responded with one single haunting line: "My family has no comment." Melanie loved the coast, and she made it her mission to stay close to California. Work wasn't hard for her to find, but as we all know, the housing market can be up and down in the Golden State, and so reasonable places aren't always available. Expenses aside, some communities are too congested, others are too dangerous, and some are just too far inland to even be considered California. Regardless, she kept her nose to the grindstone and she made it work. A few years ago, Melanie was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It was a perfect balance of open space and nice, distant neighbors that kept away. It was true isolation. The area had no streetlights, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking the moonlight. It never bothered Melanie, though it made her little house feel even more quaint on dark nights. A humble cottage, all to her lonesome. Melanie came home from work one day in the middle of winter. It was turning into a cloudy night, so pulling up to her house, she saw only what her headlights and front porch light could illuminate. Darkness swallowed everything in between. When she got out of her car, she caught a whiff of something. Something offensive? Something a little familiar? Could have been a skunk, but then she thought, no, this was too earthy to be a skunk. There didn't seem to be anyone around, so Melanie dismissed her concerns and she continues inside. She had just gotten off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so exhaustion crept into her bones. Even though it wasn't 7 p.m. yet, she decided to take a shower and call it a night. Melanie woke up sometime later, certain that she had heard a noise from inside her house. She wasn't worried immediately because her friend would sometimes stop by to use her shower after work on his way to his night classes. She had even given him a spare key so that he could stop by even if she wasn't home. Melanie's house stood in a central location between major cities, and so existed a perfect stop-off location for her friends and family in the area. If someone needed to use a toilet, grab a snack, or just generally disappear for an hour or two, this could be done at Melanie's residence. However, the one who had the key that would come take a shower sometimes would always text her to let her know that he was on the way beforehand, and Melanie hadn't heard her phone go off. She reached over to the bedside table and picked up her cell phone to see if her friend had sent a text, and the bright light from her phone's screen blinded her. Through Melanie's squinted eyes, she could make out that it was 9-something p.m. She couldn't tell if she had an unread text, though. So, in her newly wakened state, she realizes, gosh, this is ridiculous. There is a much simpler way to see if her friend was in the house, and it didn't involve flash-banging herself with her cell phone. So, she sets her phone back down on the table, and she calls out for her friend's name. There were a couple of seconds of silence before she heard loud footfalls as someone started running through the bottom floor of her house. And not only were they running, but they were pounding their fists against the ceiling as well, which was the floor of her bedroom. What an odd thing to do, she thought. Why would they do that? It was only then that she realized it wasn't someone pounding on the floor, but it was the knocking of her heart against her ribs. It was knocking so hard it nearly made the bed shake. Whoever was downstairs definitely was not a friend. Whoever was down there didn't even know that she was in the house. Sweat came to life across every inch of Melanie's body. She leapt out of bed and she ran to the closet. The person, the man, or whatever it was, the thing, was already up the stairs by the time she had opened the door and stepped inside. Melanie was certain that the cacophony of her heart would lead whatever it was right to her. The house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, one of which she was in, and then a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed. She had done this out of habit, but the bathroom door was cracked open. She heard whoever was in her house thunder down the hallway past her door and into the bathroom. Thank God, she thought. That gave Melanie just enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of the closet that she was hiding in and hoist herself up. She had just started to lift herself when the person thundered out of the bathroom and then back into the hallway, mere inches from her dangling legs. Her feet were barely inside of the attic when her bedroom door exploded inward. Footsteps stormed inside, and then they paused, and then she could hear them shuffle around. When this person didn't see her in that room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room. There were only boxes in that room. They were just stacked up in the corner, and some weights and a table where she painted her miniature models. To the person who was clearly looking for someone, it would be obvious to them by now that there was nobody in that room. She guessed that whoever this was decided that if someone were hiding, it would be in the bedroom. It had to be, because it was the only room with furniture. So they charged back into her bedroom and they turned on the light. She could see shadows dancing under the lip of the door, showing Melanie exactly where this person was going, until he stepped right up to the closet and nearly ripped the door off the hinges. She nearly whimpered at this point, but instead, she pulled back from view, shrouded by the darkness of the attic. She was crouched just a foot or so away from the access point, so she could try to stop them if they were to see her and climb up. Now, from Melanie's vantage point, all she could see was from about their knees down. And now she could see that this thing was definitely human, and a man, no less. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and worn-out work boots. Melanie's mind started to wander, not far, but to something in recent memory, a news story. It was earlier that same year, and it was somewhere in Miami. Some guy had gotten high and attacked another man on the street and chewed most of his face off in the 20 minutes that it took for the police to show up and finally shoot the guy. Florida, California, both had lots of drifters. Was this something like that? Was this a drug-fueled rampage in a sleepy resort town? And maybe, more importantly, how much time did she have? 20 minutes? Like the man that had his face gnawed off? After a few seconds of looking in the closet, the man stepped away. And then came a huge crash and a ferocious scream. It was one of the angriest sounds that Melanie had ever heard. It reminded her of her stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he had lost his temper. And back then, just like now, she would do her very best to hide from whatever danger might find her. Melanie's stepfather would eventually be put in a hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. He would always smash things, scream, he would flip furniture, sometimes there would be physical violence. These were all of the same boxes that the man downstairs was ticking. The intruder ran back down the stairs, and Melanie continued to hear crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture was being knocked to the ground. She stayed crouched in that attic, though. Melanie, in that moment, realized something. She had left her cell phone on the bedside table as she ran for the closet, and she wasn't certain that she could climb down without him hearing. She replayed the bullet points from the Florida news story and wondered what her own headline would look like. Local woman strangled to death in rental, suspect at large. After some time, the noises stopped, and Melanie, feeling like a trapped animal, didn't take the bait. She was sure that he was still down there, just waiting for her to come out. So, she starts slowly counting to herself. 1, 2, 3, 4. And by the time she reached 1,000, she decided that it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. In all of that time, she never heard a single creak. She told herself that if she did hear something, she would simply restart her clock. It was a breathless descent back to the floor, dangling 1 foot, waiting for the powerful grip of the stranger to yank her down into his arms, but thankfully, it never came. Her other foot came down and Melanie was back on the floor. The first thing that she noticed when she exited the closet was that the intruder had flipped her bed over. That was the loud noise that she had heard after he stepped away from the closet. Not only was this guy going to any length to find her, he was also incredibly strong. Melanie slept on a California king, true to her Golden State dream, with a frame and all, and the guy flipped it like it was nothing. She couldn't find her cell phone, so she went to the landline by the bed and she called the police. She filed a report and told the dispatcher everything that had happened and fielded all the questions that came her way. She stayed on the line with them until the red and blue lights showed up outside her window. And still, Melanie waited in her room until she heard them announce themselves downstairs. The first floor was a complete mess, but, she had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped, all the books and the pictures and the knickknacks that she had on her shelves were all strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened, and all of the boxed and canned goods had been thrown to the ground. As far as Melanie can tell, the only thing that was missing was a single knife out of the woodblock in the kitchen. The queasy syrup of anxiety slowly filled the spaces that adrenaline was leaving behind. She'd been right, and the intent implied by the missing blade was all the evidence that she needed. This guy was going to kill her. The police checked the house from top to bottom, and they found that the side door had been forced open by something similar to a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along her fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen tube. The police mentioned that some people use those empty pen tubes to smoke, narcotics out of. It was all enough to make Melanie's head spin. And that's when she realized whoever that was must have been out there smoking a cigarette when she got home. That was the strange smell that she caught as she pulled in. And if there had been a pile of smoked butts, that told Melanie that he'd been watching her house for a long, long time. He must have seen her arrive. Maybe he wasn't after anything at all, just wanted her. Yuck. The police collected up the evidence and told her that she should stay with family or friends that night and get that door fixed as soon as possible. Beyond that, she was on her own again. She opted to just not sleep at all through the rest of the night, and early morning, she moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple of hours just cleaning up her house. She would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and the foil. Despite Melanie's bubbling paranoia, she never saw anything there. The next day, she called to have the door fixed and to have motion lights installed at the back and the sides of her house. She ran a phone cable up into the attic and added a landline. Melanie never wanted to be stuck up there again without a phone. According to Melanie, nothing has happened to her in this house since this night. But still, she believes that the motion-censored lights and all the extra precautions that she was taking were some of the best investments that she could ever make. Have you ever worked at a restaurant before? How about a department store? I am of the mind, and I know this is going to make me sound like the biggest boomer ever, but I strongly believe that everyone entering the workforce should spend a year or two working in either fast food and or retail. I just think, floating through those positions for the first couple of years of your working career, you'll really learn how not to treat other human beings. Some people out there are just so disrespectful. I think we'd have a lot less assholes if that was just the way things were. That's just me. Speaking of people treating other people like assholes, let me get into the next story. Benny delivered pizza, and he'd been having a really busy night. It was nonstop, back and forth, without any time to even pause to take a leak. He'd been so busy that he wasn't really thinking about bathroom breaks. That's just how the industry is. When you get good at your job, you start shaving parts of yourself off that hold you back. Things like the need for sleep, or the need to eat, even the need to go to the bathroom. He disavowed his personal needs in order to keep working. He imagined Sisyphus wasn't allowed any bathroom breaks while he was pushing that boulder up the hill, so Benny wouldn't take one either. He considered the trucker epidemic as well, and the endless aisles of piss bottles strewn about the highways of the United States. Everyone was forsaking the need to pee. But they were also going through a bit of a heat wave in the area, so Benny'd been drinking copious amounts of water. All of a sudden, he was driving to this particular delivery, and the urge to go just hits him like a wall. Things went from 0 to 60 in an instant. Thankfully, he was close to the customer, so he could get this one over with quickly. Being a delivery man by trade, he was used to holding it to the last bitter second. He pulls up to the house, which is an area that he delivered in before, and immediately saw that something wasn't right. All of the lights in the house were off. There wasn't even the glow of a TV. It was extra apparent because the street lights closest to the door also happened to be out of order. And on top of it all, the entire block was dead quiet. This property was right out of a horror movie. It was a big university area, and obviously there weren't many student renters in July, but there had to be at least one person, because someone ordered this pizza. But from Benny's perspective, whoever ordered it must have been chilling in complete and utter darkness. Maybe they just liked sitting in the dark, or maybe they were outside in the backyard. Whatever. He still didn't want to get out of his car and knock on a quiet house in the middle of the night without first checking that he had the correct address, or at least that someone was inside. Benny thinks, could this be a prank? But he shakes that off. Pizza deliveries were usually sent to unsuspecting people. not empty houses. He then considers that maybe this is a setup of some kind, and that made Benny's skin turn ice cold. He thought of that movie, 30 Minutes or Less, where some people order a pizza and then strap a bomb to the delivery man's chest. It was a funny movie, but it was actually based on a real incident. Some poor bastard fell into, essentially, the same situation, and the bomb detonated before he could finish whatever they wanted him to do. Benny looked around the dark streets. He didn't think there was a bomb vest waiting for him out there, but there could be something. It was scorching that night as well, even after sundown, and Benny's AC was a complete joke. And, to make matters worse, the piping hot pizzas in the back of his car didn't keep the interior cool at all, obviously. So he had to try and just open the car door as infrequently as possible to keep any fresh air. He called the number that the customer provided, and the voice on the other end said, kind of brusquely and out of breath, "Yeah?" Benny just tried to keep it clear and concise. He says, "Hey, your pizza's out front, but there doesn't seem to be anybody home?" And then he hears the customer reply, still gasping for air, say, "Yeah, I'm not home." Benny had to pee so badly by that point that he was much less patient than he would have otherwise been. He goes on to say, "Well, then we're going to have to terminate the order because, listen, I've arrived in the stated delivery window and you were supposed to pay in cash, so I don't know what to tell you. Plan ahead next time. See you later." He instantly regretted letting his bladder do the talking for him as the voice on the other end came through more clearly, this time as a young, bubbly, and very distraught girl who couldn't have been older than 20. She comes in on the line more clearer now and she says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I was running down the street so I could barely hear you." She starts crying now. She goes on to say, "I just switched you out of my AirPods. Is that better? Can you hear me better now? So sorry. I completely lost track of time at work, but I knew you were coming. That's why I'm literally running home right now. Please don't leave. I'm starving and I don't have a car. Seriously, don't leave. I'll be there in 5 minutes tops." Benny knew what it was like to be hungry and to be running late and to have no car and also not live near any restaurants. Plus, when he heard her voice, he began to remember more specifically having delivered to this place a couple of times before, and the person who lived there was also a young girl, always seemed to be perfectly nice. And now he felt bad for snapping at her. He tried to walk it back while simultaneously looking out his window. Nice or not, he was still pissing on this lady's front lawn. Benny replies and says, No, my bad. Look, I'm just letting the heat get to me. It's not your fault. No need to rush. I'll see you when you get here." They hang up, and while Benny's surveying the streets, he starts to think that he was really just out of luck. All of the other houses had people in them and were close together, so there were no clumps of trees or out-of-the-way patches of land or anything. Of course, he had just tossed his empty water bottle at the last delivery because, in his own words, he was an idiot. He thinks to himself, I could have been a real bottle-filling truck hoser, and then he laughs to himself too. Finally, he decides that it was escalating to the point of an emergency, and the safest bet was just to use a bush in front of the woman's house. She wasn't home, the streetlights were out so no one would see him, and the people that were home were all inside, the surrounding homes probably minding their own business. His car was parked across the street, and he worked for a small shop that didn't wear uniforms, so if somebody did spot him, they'd have no way to connect him to his employer. And plus, animals pee outside all the time. Humans are animals. This was fine. In fact, it was so dark, it was almost as if God himself had given Benny permission to piss on this lady's front yard. So, Benny scurries over to the tallest bush in her front yard. She didn't really have much of a yard, mind you. It was more just a walkway that was lined with bushes and flowers that kind of ran adjacent to her front door. The biggest cluster of bushes, the only one where he could be sure that there would be no visible splatter on the side of the house, was about 4 feet from the front door. He approaches the bush, he looks all around him, and then he unzips and lets fly. After the initial blast of relief, he noticed the sound was different. More like peeing on something solid than something leafy like he was expecting. Benny almost decided to pinch the flow, scared that he was actually peeing on something important, that was being stored under the bushes. So he starts to panic, and once he started, he couldn't stop midstream. You know what I mean? I don't know if you've ever tried to stop midstream, but it's hard. It hurts. So he kept squinting into the darkness to see if maybe he was hitting like a key rock or some sort of electrical box and could simply adjust his liquid mortar fire by a few inches to avoid it. But instead, he hears a way more concerning noise. He hears a deep voice shout loudly, "What the f-?" Benny winced. What the fuck indeed? He didn't know where that voice was coming from, but it could apparently read his mind. Before Benny could turn around, assuming he'd been caught by a neighbor, a man comes leaping out of the bushes. He blows past Benny, brushing the golden shower off of himself as he did, and he spit pretty emphatically on the ground as well, so Benny thought that he might have, well, let's just say spritzed his lips. He didn't see where the man went. After a few paces, Benny was more concerned with zipping up his pants. A car roars to life just out of sight, and somewhere up the street, he peels out a second later. Benny's eyes, by now, had gained a little bit of night vision, and he was able to make out the man's height, his build, and his outfit, but only the most general details of each. He was a black shadow in motion, literally, and absolutely dripping in Benny's urine. Benny was in such shock that he still didn't put his little ting-ting away. He just stood there, trying to figure out what was happening, who that was. The reality was so terrifying that his mind refused to accept it, and he just impulsively started searching for a reasonable explanation that would make everything okay. Was this a neighbor? A gardener? Yeah, Benny, that's it. A nocturnal gardener, sure. Could these bushes lead to some backyard area and just look like they were against the house? Maybe the bushes were obscuring an open window. Benny went frosty cold again. Did he piss into the house? His inner voice was desperately screaming that the man had been wearing a hoodie in 90-degree weather. That was definitely not a good man, and this was not a good situation to be in. But the very idea that he'd been within inches of a guy who would be hiding in the bushes at all, let alone in front of a young woman's house at night, just didn't add up to Benny's simple, frenzied mind. He was there to deliver a pizza. He wasn't a detective. His fight-or-flight response totally failed him at that point because, again, in Benny's own words, his dumbass did the absolute last thing that he should have done, and he approached the bushes to try and validate the theory that there had to be a good reason for a man in a hoodie to be behind them in the middle of the night. Benny's curiosity? 11. Benny's survival instincts? 0. Any sense of self-preservation? -8. So, Benny walked over to the side. He turned his phone flashlight on and he tries to peer around the line of shrubbery. The cone of light illuminated everything that it touched, but the small relief that it provided made the rest of the darkness all-encompassing. Benny's eyes grew a lot wider in pure terror as he realized how vulnerable he was. That's when he saw something that would trigger a change in everything that would happen for the rest of the night. What he saw in his phone's flashlight sitting on the ground was a tattered drawstring bag sitting behind the bushes, of course splashed with pee. Benny was in such a moronic daze, again, his words, not mine, from shock that he groped around the bag thinking it would explain why the man was in there. And oh boy, what a find. Once he maneuvered it over and pulled the bag open, he pulled out a sharp knife, a roll of duct tape, and a bottle of pills. Benny's shaking, pee-covered hands rolled over everything in disbelief, and the delusions, at that point, finally break. All of the adrenaline and the endorphins and the self-preservation instincts that had been suppressed kick in 10 times over now, and Benny has this train of thoughts, but the loudest one was this question: what the hell am I doing out here? He became whatever the opposite of dazed. was. He was more laser-focused than he had ever been in his entire life, and he now had one singular goal: get back to the car. Benny dropped the bag, and he booked it across the street. He gets in his car and slams the pedal to the floor. He redlines the engine until he hits a red light, and then he pulls off to the side and realizes that he shouldn't be driving anymore, not in his insane condition. He rolled into the parking lot of a 24-hour drugstore, and he takes a breath. He's finally calm and coherent enough to properly zip up finally and formulate a plan of action. His first lucid thought was who he should call first, the police or the girl whose house that was. He thought about it for what couldn't have been more than 10 seconds, though it felt like an hour for Benny, and he decided that she needed to know not to keep walking in that direction. But as he dialed her number, it occurred to him, what if there was no girl? The bomb movie was rattling around in his brain again. A trap, a lure. He thought he remembered delivering to that house before, but what if he was wrong? What if the girl on the phone was just a decoy to get him there to rob him, or worse? Every pizza guy on the planet had seen the Evil Genius documentary by now, and she had called him all out of breath. She wasn't home, the whole thing was just off, and he felt like he couldn't risk it. So instead of calling the customer, Benny calls 911. The operator was very helpful in keeping him calm, because he was far more emotional than he realized. The operator kept assuring him that someone would be there soon. Benny stammers to the operator. He says, oh God, wait. And the dispatcher asks, what's wrong? And Benny says, you have to get to the house. You have to get to the girl's house. He still might be waiting for her. Dispatcher says, sir, we... And then Benny cuts her off and he screams, he could have gone back. She could be dead. Dispatcher says, sir, you need to remain calm. Just take some breaths and stay on the line with me. Benny starts to stutter more rebuttals out, and the dispatcher says, listen, I'll put you on hold if you speak any further. So Benny bites his lips. He shakes his head and then he swallows the rest of his words. His phone buzzed and he looked down to see that it was an incoming call. He would have to hang up on the 911 dispatcher to answer it. He figured it was his boss, so Benny ignores it. And then a text comes through not 10 seconds later. It says, hey, I'm here. I don't see you. Benny looks down and he reads the text, and goosebumps erupted across his neck and forearms. She was home. She was standing in that guy's shadow. So Benny speaks up to the dispatcher and says, she's there. Dispatcher says officers are en route to both locations. Please remain calm. Benny was overwhelmed with guilt. En route did not mean on scene. Who knew how long it would take for them to get there? He rereads the text that says, hey, I'm here, I don't see you, and he wonders if those could be the girl's last words. He imagined her being strangled against the pavement of her own driveway. Benny thinks to himself, I could have saved her. I could have stayed and prevented anything terrible from happening. His rational mind said the odds of her being a decoy girl for some large scam targeting pizza guys were low, and the odds of her being the intended victim of a predator were much higher. So, Benny puts the 911 call on mute to where he could hear them but they couldn't hear him, and then he shifted his car back into drive. His heart is absolutely pounding out of his chest, and he's compulsively muttering the F word over and over to himself as he drives back to the girl's neighborhood. When he gets there, he takes 911 off of mute, and he tells them that he just drove back to the house. And the dispatcher says, you've got to be kidding me. Benny didn't care though. He saw the girl meandering past the cars, so he waves her down with his brights. He flashes his brights at her, and then she bounces over to the window of his car. She seems very happy-go-lucky, and she had no idea there was a shark lurking somewhere just behind her. Benny figured this was a good sign that she wasn't in on whatever this was, but still, he was petrified to be near the scene of a potential crime again. He kept whispering to the girl, get in, get in. But she didn't understand. She was saying, get it? Huh? Oh, you want me to get the pizza from the bag? Okay. All the while, she was talking impossibly loud. He needed to get her in the car. Benny didn't want to make the same mistake with her that he had made with dispatch, so instead of trying to tell her the whole story, he just stuck to the bare basic facts. He says to this girl, "I tried to deliver your pizza, but there was a man in your bushes. I'm on the phone with the cops right now. I don't know where the guy is. Please get in the car so that we can lock the doors." Benny relished watching her face go shock white. He holds up his phone with the 911 on the call screen just to really hammer it home for this girl that he is on the phone with the police right now. And the girl walks around to the passenger side of the car and basically falls in, and they get locked up and then they get moving. Dispatcher says, "Are you there? Is she with you? Are you safe? Is anyone else there?" Benny replies, "Yes, I've got her." Dispatcher says, "Okay, good. We heard another party, just wasn't sure who you made contact with." He reassured the dispatcher, and they drove, more cautiously this time, to a location that 911 instructed them to wait at so that they could speak with police after the officers cleared the area. They needed a statement, they needed descriptions, and everything else to get an investigation going. And as far as the girl is concerned, it turns out the reason that she got right into the pizza guy's car without probing any deeper into his story was because she knew who the lurking man was right away from Benny's description. You see, the girl had an abusive ex-boyfriend who was apparently psychotic enough that he immediately came to mind when she heard the words, "There's a guy in your bushes." Alright, if you're a dog person, then you are going to love this next story. Duke was a senior in high school, and he was home alone. His parents were at a wedding that required them to stay at a hotel, and Duke's brother was working the night shift. Being his last year in high school, and a bit of a social butterfly, this was a rare occurrence for him. His parents rarely trusted him to be alone, and when they did, his brother usually threw a rager of a party. But rather than throw a party, Duke chose just to enjoy the silence of the evening and the relaxation of being home alone. During this time, Duke's family lived in a very well-known East Coast city in a blue-collar neighborhood that was starting to take a nosedive. This weekend, he was looking forward to engaging in some PlayStation on the big screen TV and then ordering a late takeout dinner while pigging out while watching Dragon Ball Z. Around 2 a.m., he'd fallen asleep on the couch with his old dog, Cecil. Cecil was a beagle who was as old as the dirt he slept in, and he had been in Duke's family for 10 years. Cecil was quiet and peaceful, and he spent most of his time begging for table scraps and scratching his butt. Unlike most beagles, Cecil never howled or barked. He was more than content to rest his head on someone's lap and just spend the entire night right there. It was approximately 1 a.m. Duke had just finished the last slice of pizza and was dozing off on the couch when he heard a bang coming from the back alleyway. At first, he didn't think much of it. Anyone who had lived in a city knew noises happened at all hours of the night. It's just called city racket. Cecil's head popped up off of his lap and his hackles actually stood up on end. Cecil was skittish by nature, so Duke calmed him down and they started dozing off again. Not more than 2 minutes later, he hears another bang, and Cecil did something that Duke had never seen him do before. The dog leaps off of the couch and he runs full tilt toward the door leading to the basement, and he's barking and he's growling like a banshee. The look on his face reminded Duke of a German Shepherd canine unit, all teeth, all killer instinct. Through the dog's barking, he could now make out a persistent banging sound. Duke's adrenaline was now thumped to life. And he asks himself, man, why didn't I just throw a party? There was a seldom used door in the basement that led to their back alleyway. It was old and rusted, and it was very hard to open, even with a key, and it made a tremendous amount of noise. Perhaps not unlike the banging that he was hearing right now. Cecil knew what was going on. He zeroed in and was barking at the problem. Now, for a bit of context for anyone who's never lived in a bad neighborhood, if someone tries to get into your house and they move on after they realize the door is locked, then that means, well, they usually just wanted your stuff. But if someone is persistently trying to get into your house despite the door being locked, well, that means they want you. Breaking and entering through your locked door is nothing compared to the crime that they actually want to commit. Duke rushed upstairs to grab the heavy wooden baseball bat that he kept under his bed, and then he nutted up and headed down to the basement. He knew he should have ran, but he was a tall dude, kind of a macho guy, big as hell, plus there was nowhere else to go. While he was heading down the stairs to the basement, Cecil blows past him and beats him downstairs. Now the dog was compromised. That was another reason to stay. A scuffle erupted in the darkness below. Duke stopped and he peered into the black, and Cecil growled. A man could now be heard grunting in pain and shrieking. Duke didn't call the cops. He just sat up for the rest of the night with the bat in his hand. After Cecil had bit the guy, everyone retreated. Duke and the dogs ran back upstairs. The intruder ran back out the way he came. It kind of reminded Duke of that old urban legend about the dog with the fingers in his mouth. You know the story where a man broke into a lady's house and the Doberman bit the fella's fingers off? Well, once the lady discovered the fingers blocking her dog's throat, she quickly discovered the man hiding in her closet too. The blood trail was easy enough to follow there. There he was, shaking and fingerless amongst the coats in her closet. Duke looked over Cecil's mouth, and he didn't see any blood. No fingers either. His breathing didn't seem restricted. Cecil and the intruder definitely had some sort of a tussle, but Cecil didn't bring anything back with him. Duke's brother came home early that morning, and Duke told him what had happened. They went to the basement door to take a look together, and when they gave it a tug to open, the whole door fell off. Duke whispered to himself, "No way. I didn't stand a chance." This psycho was one good shove away from getting into the house, but old Cecil scared him off. Since this story has happened, Duke has admitted that they have had to put Cecil down. He got too old, natural causes, he just didn't have the will to live anymore. And before the injection, Duke got a chance to be alone with Cecil. He thanked him one last time for his friendship and for what he did that night. By now, Duke was a grown man with a wife and kids, and he's convinced that none of that would have happened without Cecil. He says, "Thanks, pal. I miss you." This is a story all about how a simple door cam led to the most terrifying experience of my life. And yeah, I'm well aware that I just threw every 90s kid for a loop with the first half of that sentence. Anyway, the date was May 4th, 2022, and I had just received my first substantial paycheck since leaving college. I immediately put the money down on a house, and within a few weeks, I was throwing a housewarming party. Everyone decided to bring gifts, even though I told them repeatedly not to. I just wanted to get together with my friends and family. Now, the gifts that they brought were nothing fancy and mostly consisted of, little things like fake plants, a doormat, and somebody brought a second-gen wired door camera. At the time, I couldn't even think of a reason why I would ever need a door cam, but still, I accepted it and I had it installed a few days later. A couple of months go by and I had only used the door cam for simple things like, making sure everything was fine while I was at work. And aside from that, I'd probably only used the device a total of 4 times, and to be honest, I forgot I even had the thing most of the time. However, that all changed on the night of October 18th, 2022. Work was extremely stressful that day, and after a couple of meetings and hours going through documents, I finally left and I didn't go home until 9 p.m. Once I got home, I quickly took a shower, and then I went downstairs to put on some Netflix and make myself something to eat. After watching TV for about an hour and a half, everything seemed fine until I heard a small noise coming from outside. I ignored the sound at first, thinking it was probably just teenagers coming home late, and it didn't sound like something I needed to worry about. A few minutes go by before I heard the next sound, and while I still couldn't make out what it was, this time it definitely sounded like something I needed to worry about. I immediately paused my movie, and I thought about going outside to find out what was wrong, and after a brief moment of realization, I decided that would be a very stupid thing to do, especially when I had a door cam for that exact reason. As I went upstairs to log onto my computer, I was only slightly worried, fully expecting it to be something irrelevant, like a cat or a raccoon. However, that all drastically changed as the door cam displayed live footage of a middle-aged woman running down the street. She wasn't very fast, and as she ran, she continued to look back at something that I assumed was chasing her. I couldn't see what or who it was, but after a while, a figure came into view, revealing what looked like a very tall white man who stood at around 6.5 feet tall. As the man approached, the running woman fell over, and now she was crawling backwards while facing the man, begging him to stop. The man didn't seem fazed by this and immediately took a few quick strides toward her before positioning himself on top of her. The two of them were now directly in front of my house, and I could see clearly as the man lifted a hammer and then swung down heavily on her head. The initial hit startled me, and I jolted back in horror and just pure shock. The woman still appeared conscious, however. I watched as she tilted her head to face the man as if begging him to stop. The man simply raised the hammer again and then brought it down once more. And this time, she didn't move anymore. The psychopath then proceeded to hit her one last time before staying completely still, crouched over her, disfigured body in silence. He stayed in that position without moving for about an entire minute. And all the while, I was also completely still, just paralyzed, frozen with fear. Everything seemed so quiet, and all I could really hear was my racing heartbeat. And that's when, like a creature out of a horror movie, the man's head spun towards my house, as if he had spotted something that he hadn't seen before. Slowly, the man's huge frame got off of the woman's body, and he too began to suddenly move towards the front door. Nothing about him seemed normal, and the closer he got to the door cam, the more I noticed the eerie feeling and look that he had that made him look even less human and more like a demon the closer he got. The man arrived at my doorstep, and my heart raced as I thought about what I would do if he tried to get in. Luckily, it seemed like he didn't want to get in at all. Instead, the man simply crouched down and was now facing my door cam. His face and his eyes just looked completely empty, and he simply stared at the camera as if he could see that I was watching him. His stare was so horrific that I could almost feel him looking right at me. But then, after a while, just like he came, he got up and walked away. Once the man was finally out of frame, I instantly ran downstairs to get my phone and to call the police. They say, 911, what's your emergency? And I say, a woman was just murdered on my street. I'm frantic at this point. It's hard for me to even get words out. And the dispatcher on the other end, she says, okay, you said there was a murder. Is there anyone else hurt? And can you tell me how many assailants there were? I replied, there was just one man with a hammer and there's just one victim. I don't know where he went, but he couldn't have gotten far. Can you please send someone quickly? But the conversation was cut short as the loud sound of a window breaking filled my room. I turned to see the killer squeezing through my broken kitchen window. He was still holding the hammer in his hand, and he was now bleeding as the glass was cutting his body as he was entering my house. My mind was racing, but my body moved faster, and without me even thinking, I was out the door and running down the street. I ran for a while, contemplating whether to stop for help or, continue running until I finally saw a police officer. My decision, however, was made when I looked back at the horrifying sight of the 6.5-foot man bolting towards me. I continued to run, ensuring that I stayed on the main road, well lit by any, overhead street lamps that were on, all the while hoping I would eventually encounter someone, despite the fact that it was pretty late in the night. The man let out this deep, blood-curdling scream as he continued to chase, and with each stride he seemed to get closer while I was growing more tired. The only thing that was getting faster was my heartbeat, and it was getting harder for me to breathe. I eventually collapsed and fell down, and all I could do was stare in horror as the man approached me. He raised his hammer to swing at me, and that's when I heard police sirens and I could see bright red and blue lights start filling the air. And for the first time, I could actually sense some sort of emotion on the man's face, and I could tell he was panicked. He looked frantically around for a way to escape, and I was finally filled with relief because, for a brief moment after all that happened that night, I was finally safe. The police easily detained the man as his only weapon was a hammer, and after that, he was soon identified as a man named Albert Fitzgerald. The police later informed me that Albert had been on the run for almost 2 years now, facing multiple charges of manslaughter, attempted murder, assault, and a lot more. Eventually, with further investigation, the police discovered there was no real motive behind the murder that I witnessed, and Albert simply decided to kill a woman that he had no prior knowledge of. A look into the mind of a psychopath who would kill a victim for no reason usually reveals the same thing. They just enjoy killing. And if my stroke of good luck was just a minute later, then I too would have ended up as a victim of Albert. In the coming months, I would testify against him, and my door cam footage would become another piece of evidence used in sentencing him to life in prison. I would go to therapy for a whole year, and the officer who was present the night that he was caught would regularly contact me to make sure I was still okay. I still have nightmares about that night though, and I always ask myself, what could have happened if I didn't have a door cam? Honestly, I think I just would have gone on living my whole life, not knowing what happened in front of my own home. Maybe Albert wouldn't have broken in that night, but all I can do is wonder and hope that I'll one day be able to completely forget about that horrific night and about Albert Fitzgerald and the murder that I saw him commit. The story that you just heard was based on the events that took place on October 16th, 2022. Albert Fitzgerald was a notoriously deranged psychopath who was wanted for numerous crimes. However, Albert made the mistake of committing a crime that was caught on an innocent citizen's door cam. This single incident led to his arrest, and he's since been prosecuted and jailed. During the research and writing phase of this episode, by the way, there was available door cam footage on the internet. However, when it came time for me to actually record the episode, that footage was no longer available. It had been stripped off of the internet from multiple sources. However, stick around because the next two stories are even more disturbing, and the footage that we were able to save from them is even more chilling. Most people start their day like clockwork. They get up, they get dressed, and they jump into their cars or their buses or their bikes, headed somewhere without giving it much thought. Every year, however, about 1.5 million people don't make it home after heading out on the road. And a lot of those deaths happen during our late night drives on the way back from a night out or heading to a club. And while most people would blame things like drunk driving or tired eyes, the real danger isn't always what they think. Sometimes, like in the case of this story, It's the things lurking out there in the darkness of the open road, hiding just beyond the headlights. My name is Ethan Williams, and on the night of February 13th, 2021, I got into my car, I pulled out of the driveway, and I started heading to a friend's party at around 9 p.m. The party was something that a few of my friends would put together every year for those of us who weren't in relationships and were looking to have some fun, have some drinks, and maybe meet someone the night before Valentine's Day. I, however, had just gotten out of a 4-year relationship, so, I wasn't very eager to go partying. But after hours of my friends convincing me, there I was, driving into town, trying to convince myself to loosen up and try to have some fun. I turned on the radio to get myself in the right mood, but the only thing that was on was this slow 90s song that I'd never heard before. It didn't matter much to me though, I wasn't a big night driver, so my focus was more on the road than the music selection anyway. The house was located in a pretty secluded and quiet area, and about 5 minutes away from it, I noticed the road that led up to the house was so dark and narrow that even with my headlights on, it was almost impossible to see anything that wasn't directly in front of my car. And the wind was blowing the huge trees around, and it was obvious the road was barely used, even during the day. But despite the difficulty in seeing, I eventually made my way to the house. After spending a couple of hours with my friends, attempting to have some fun, I decided to call it a night. And by 3 a.m. on Valentine's Day, I said my goodbyes and I started the drive back home. My mood was quite different during the return drive, and after a couple of minutes of sitting in silence, I noticed that it had gotten much darker outside and I could barely see anything that wasn't in reach of my headlights. Soon enough, about 7 minutes into my drive, I got to an area that seemed impossibly darker than the other places, which I naturally assumed was the road that I had used earlier that night on my way to the house. I slowed down, and after once again carefully driving through the darkness, I made it out onto the city roads, where I thought everything would be perfectly fine from then on until I made it home. The ride that night was nothing, out of the ordinary. All I had on my mind was taking a hot shower and getting into bed, and all I could see ahead of me was just big empty road. When suddenly, out of nowhere, I spotted something in the distance, and I immediately got that sinking feeling, like when you just know something's off. At first, I could barely make out what it was, so I drove a bit closer. I thought to myself, what the heck? The strange scene in front of me finally came into view. A black car seemed to be broken down on the side of the road, and 2 safety cones had been set up beside the car in an attempt to stop cars from passing. In the few seconds that I stopped to check out the scene, I heard footsteps coming from the distance as a man slowly revealed himself from the darkness ahead. Although I couldn't see anything but a pair of jeans walking towards my car, I knew everything about that situation was just wrong, and I needed to get out of there fast. The man continued to approach my car slowly, like weirdly slowly, and I decided the best thing to do would be to drive through the cones and get the heck out of there. But as I put my foot on the gas, the man quickly gets in the way of the car, forcing me to stop. At this point, he was now close enough for me to see his face, and my stomach dropped in horror as I saw the massive scar that ran along his entire face, leaving him with only one working eye. The man wasn't huge in any way. He was probably 5'6", 150 pounds. He walked up to the side of my car and he pressed his face against the window while knocking, slowly, with this sinister smile on his face. He wasn't wearing gloves or a mask or anything, and I think his intentions seemed pretty clear to me, and in that moment, I was completely frozen with fear, and all I could do was pray that someone else would come along. This horrific man continued to knock and breathe on my window. After taking a minute to calm down, I realized that since he was now standing by the side of the car, there was nobody else blocking the road, and that might have been my only chance to escape. So, I take a deep breath, and I turn to the man before saying, "What do you want? Man, I don't have any money. Please, just let me go." And then the man backed up from the window a little bit, and I could see, something that felt like excitement in his eyes as he said back, "What do I want? I just want to go for a ride, that's all." At this point, I realized most of his teeth were missing, and I remember shaking with fear as I maintained eye contact with him. I knew I had to find a way to change gears without him noticing, though, so I began to slowly reach for the gear while asking him some more questions to hopefully distract him. I said, "Please, man, I just want to go home to my wife and my kids. Why are you doing this?" I said that in an attempt to make him feel sorry for me, but instead, all I got was this glimmer in his eyes as he noticed my hand grab the gear to change it. He immediately lets out a screech and he slams a machete through my window. At this point, I'm startled. I am so freaked out. I just ignore the glass shards that are now, being thrown all around the car and all around me from his machete, and I slam on the gas and I start taking off through the cones and down the street. I didn't have any time to compose myself or relax, however, because I turned to my left to see this insane image of a man latched onto my car door. He lets out this menacing laugh that honestly I will never forget until the day I die, before he eventually grabs onto my arm and he causes the car to swerve violently. The struggle continues for a while, but eventually, after latching onto my arm one final time, the man began to pull himself in through the window while grunting heavily. Before I could react, I could feel his teeth sink deep into my neck. As I shrugged him off, he lets out a laugh, and there seems to be a joy that he gets from seeing his mouth covered with blood. Terrified of what he'd do next, I ball up my fist and I just punch him a few times, and immediately I notice this has an effect on this dude. Go figure. So I slam on the brakes, and that flings him off of my door and onto the road ahead of me. At this point, I was losing a lot of blood after being bitten and cut up by broken glass and stuff, and my hands were visibly shaking. My whole entire body was vibrating. Every part of me wanted to run this dude over. But as I watched him struggling on the ground, I couldn't bring myself to move. About a minute later, he got up slowly before eventually limping off into the darkness by the side of the road. About 20 minutes later, I end up at a hospital, after what had happened. And the doctors, well, understandably, they had a lot of questions for me, and the police were contacted as well shortly after I arrived. Once I received treatment, I gave my statement to the police, and although they were informed about the scheme that robbers used to get victims to stop late at night, they seemed very concerned by the man that I described and the extent to which he was willing to go. A search party was put out for him that night, but despite all of their efforts, he wasn't found that night or the next morning. That being said, his description was all over the news for the following weeks. And although this man was never found, it became common knowledge to everyone living in Memphis, Tennessee, to never stop for stranded drivers when taking a late-night drive in the city. The story that you just heard is based on the highway robbery scheme that occurred in 2016 in Memphis, Tennessee. This happened during a period that saw a string of numerous staged accident scams that took over the country, leading to countless robberies and murders of people that had stopped to help fake stranded motorists and ended up getting robbed or assaulted and, in some cases, killed by the very people that they were trying to help. This disturbing experience happened at the start of my 2009 spring break. My friends and I had just left college for the break, and we all spent the long car ride home making crazy plans on what to do during that holiday. Over the years, spring break had become a really special holiday for me and my friends because we always made sure to spend the few weeks that we had doing the craziest things at some new location. In 2007, we flew to Cancun, Mexico to enjoy the beaches, eat street tacos, and explore the ancient ruins. This was such a fun trip that we decided to take things up a notch in 2008 when we went to Miami. The details of the Miami trip were even crazier. We crashed cruises, we messed around in the Miami Zoo, and we stayed out all night clubbing. We kept talking about this insane trip for months on end after the break was over, and we knew that we had to take things up another notch for the next one. This 2009 spring break was also going to be one of our last, and we wanted to do something different from what we had done in the past. It took us hours to decide where our next location was going to be because every one of us had different ideas. During these conversations, my friends and I decided that we didn't want to go somewhere sunny or beachy again because we'd already done that by visiting Cancun and Miami, so we narrowed down our possible locations to places where it wasn't too sunny. We all kept suggesting places and putting it to a vote, and after about a half hour, the location that we decided on was a place called the Daring Woods. The Daring Woods is a place that's located in Smarton, England, and these particular woods are widely known to the locals as the Screaming Woods. It was suggested by one of my friends, Trevor, who was an avid lover of everything haunted and paranormal. Trevor told us that these woods were known to be some of the most haunted woods in the world, and he said it would make a great spring break trip because we could experience something that was, in his words, out of this world. I wasn't really a skeptical person, but, I still didn't see the point in going there, as I wasn't interested in any ghost stories or having any out-of-body experiences. And since I wasn't convinced, I brought up alternative options to my friends because I felt like there was probably much better places that we could spend the break. But Trevor had already managed to convince the rest of the friend group, and they all voted for the Daring Woods to be where we would spend our next spring break. After all the necessary preparations were made, we booked our flights to Smarton, England. When we arrived, we rented a blue truck because we had all decided on going car camping in the Daring Woods. I had been on numerous car camping trips with my father in the past, and car camping was a bit different from a usual camping trip, and since I had the most experience with it, I was the one who planned out everything that we needed for the trip. It took about 2 hours to get everything ready, and once we were done, we made our way to the Daring Woods. I could tell all my friends were very excited about the trip due to the huge smiles on their faces, but to be honest, I wasn't as excited as they were. This was mainly because I had been doing some research on the history of the Daring Woods, and I actually uncovered a lot of disturbing details. For starters, there had been numerous reports of visitors hearing blood-curdling screams coming from the depths of the forest at night. Strange whispers and footsteps had also been heard on foggy days, and these odd reports happened far too often for it to be a coincidence. When I looked deeper into the history of the forest, I found out the usual screams that are often heard at night are actually believed to be made by a highwayman who was captured by the local villagers in the 18th century and then brutally killed in the Daring Woods. Many locals believe the highwayman still holds a grudge, which is why he lets out guttural screams to keep trespassers away. I initially told myself that the highwayman story was just a folktale, just an old ghost story to scare little kids. But the more I looked into the Daring Woods, the more horrors I found. And after an hour of digging into the woods' history, I came across one of the most disturbing things that happened in the Daring Woods in 1948. The details of the incident stated that on November 1st, 1948, 20 people were found dead in the Daring Woods. The massacre was discovered that morning, and numerous locals had reported seeing strange lights coming from the forest just the night before. And what was even more disturbing was that the forensics who had retrieved the bodies couldn't determine how the 20 people died after the autopsies were carried out. No matter how hard I looked on the internet, I couldn't find a plausible explanation for the strange deaths, as some locals believed a morbid ritual was carried out that night, and the spirits of the 20 people who died were the ones responsible for the hauntings of the forest. Others believed that those 20 people gave their lives to strengthen the oak trees that mysteriously grew in the forest after their deaths. All these incidents and reports really started to freak me out, so I told Trevor and the rest of the friend group about my concerns. Trevor then told us that he already knew about all of these incidents, and that was the main reason why he wanted us to go there. I still remember him making jokes about the whole thing as he said, "Do you know how cool it would be if we saw a real ghost? We could capture it, we could take it back to the college and then sell it to the government for $1 bazillion, or we could use the ghost to scare some hot chicks into our arms." The entire group laughed at Trevor's jokes, as they said all the reports were just a load of made-up stories, but I think I knew in my gut that there were some truths to all of the disturbing things that I had uncovered while researching. I also knew that no matter how I felt on the matter, it was far too late to turn back now, and I didn't want to bring down the mood on our spring break by complaining about the history of the location, so I just didn't bring it up again. After a long drive, we eventually arrived at the Daring Woods. I told them to park the truck at the side of the road so that we could find a suitable clearing in the woods before we set up camp. It took us about a few minutes of walking to find a good clearing, and then after gathering some wood, we went to the truck and parked it in our camping spot. Once we were settled, we spent the evening drinking beers and talking about girls. Trevor kept making dumb ghost jokes that made everyone laugh, and after a few more drinks and jokes, all of the fears that I had about the Daring Woods went away. We joked around until it got really late, and it wasn't long before we had to start a fire to stay warm. We kept talking well into the night, and I eventually started feeling sleepy, but before I could doze off, I was awoken by a muffled scream coming from the woods. Alarmed, I said, "Did you guys just hear that scream?" My friends laughed as they thought I was playing a prank, and Nate, who was sitting right next to me, said, "Stop messing around, Chris. It's not funny." I told them that I wasn't joking, and I actually urged them to listen carefully, but all they could hear was this eerie silence. Nate then said, "You know you don't have to lie about hearing screams, Chris. If you don't want to be here, you can just say so." I understood where Nate was coming from, because it seemed like I was just making things up in order to get us to leave. But before I could tell them that I wasn't lying, a blood-curdling scream ripples through the forest. Everyone heard it this time, and we all got on our feet. Nate pulled out his phone, and he started recording because he wanted to capture what was making these noises, but I knew it wasn't safe to stay and find out. It was hard to explain what the noises sounded like, but I knew that I'd never heard these sounds before. Nate tried to get everyone to calm down by telling us that it was just an elk, but I told him it wasn't, because I knew the sound elks made, and this was totally different. I also knew what the usual forest animal sounded like, because I learned these sounds whenever I went car camping with my father in the past, and these otherworldly screams that we were hearing sounded nothing like those. The strange sounds kept getting louder and louder with each second, so I told everyone to leave our things and to get back to the truck. Once everyone was in and seated, I started the truck, but before I could press the gas, I saw something odd in my rearview mirror. It looked like the oak trees that were only a few feet away from us had started to turn their heads and move. I blinked to make sure that I wasn't seeing things, and I watched in pure horror as the trees tore their roots from the ground and then started to lunge toward us. Horrified, I stepped on the gas and I sped out of there. But even if I was going as fast as I could still hear what sounded and looked like those trees running after us. I'm pretty sure I had passed the speed limit at this point, and I kept hitting the gas. We were on the road now, and I thought we had finally managed to lose whatever was back there, but suddenly this odd creature appears right in front of the car, and we actually collide with it. We make impact with this thing. The truck came to a complete stop, and it seemed like we had hit a large rock. I had hit my head on the steering wheel during the impact, and my vision was all blurry now, but I could have sworn I saw a wooden giant standing in front of our truck. I only caught a glimpse of it for a few seconds, but I swear this creature had wooden skin and razor-sharp branch-like arms and green bushes growing out of its head. It disappeared right before I could say a word, and I looked around to see if anyone else had seen what I had saw. But before I could say anything, our truck was then attacked. It felt like we had been ambushed by 6 large bears as the truck was thrown around by the creatures that surrounded it. We could hear the continuous scratches scraping at the truck's doors in addition to the screams that we had heard before. We also couldn't see what was attacking us, and I remember just locking the doors and hoping that they wouldn't be able to get in as we simply waited out the attack. The entire incident lasted for about 5 minutes before the creatures left, and my heart was in my throat during the entire ordeal because I didn't know how long it would take before they would eventually rip through the truck's metal doors and then tear us limb from limb. We all stayed there in silence, and I hoped that they wouldn't come back to finish what they had started. I don't know how long we remained crouched in fear, but the sun eventually came up. I then took my phone and I dialed the authorities to tell them that we had been attacked. And once the authorities arrived, we explained everything that happened. To nobody's surprise, the officers didn't believe the story that walking oak trees attacked us, as they told us that we were just seeing things due to the many beers that we had taken in earlier. Even when we showed them the footage that Mark had captured, they still didn't believe us because they thought we were just pulling a prank on them. After inspecting the truck, the authorities, who could tell the markings on the vehicle were real, told us that we were probably attacked by some wild wolves or some other savage pack of animals that roamed the area. The officers then told us that they were supposed to arrest us for driving while intoxicated, but thankfully, they let us off the hook after we told them that the only reason we drove was to get away from the wild animals. Our parents were quickly informed after the incident, and after the authorities had finished asking all of the additional questions that they needed to carry out further investigations into the attack, we were all sent on a flight back home. Spring break was never the same after that. It took a lot of time for us to get over that incident. The experience scarred all of us, and honestly, I never went on a car camping trip again with my father because of what happened that day. It's been a few years now, and I've been able to move past it, but I still think about what happened that night from time to time, and I consider myself lucky to have survived the unexplainable horrors that are still out there, lurking in the daring woods. The story you just heard comes from a disturbing car camping case that happened in the Daring Woods that are located in Smarton, England. On the 29th of March, 2009, 4 friends went car camping in the Daring Woods with a blue truck. Things went well for the group at first, but a few minutes after they had set up their campfire, they began to hear strange noises ringing throughout the entire forest. These sounds could be heard in the footage captured by a member of the group before they all rushed to their truck. A few investigations had been carried out into the incident, and the strange screaming sounds heard on the footage have been analyzed by numerous experts, but none of the specialists who have analyzed the footage have been able to say or identify the animal or whatever it was that let out those blood-curdling screams that night. What do you think it was?
Hear it? Get Trevor. Austin, get the light.
Fuck. Hey!
That was not an elk. Get my keys. Ah, get ready. Everybody, get in my truck.
If you liked this video, thank you. Click subscribe. I've got plenty more on the channel for you to binge right now. So why am I starting this series in California? What is it about this state that attracts every cryptid, monster, and unidentified creature this side of the Rockies? Well, for starters, you've got geographic diversity that is actually kind of insane. Up north, you've got these dense redwood forests where the trees are so massive and packed in so tight that visibility drops to maybe a dozen feet on a good day. You've got mountain ranges, the Santa Lucias, the Sierra Nevadas, where people can hike for literal days without encountering another human being. You've also got deserts where the heat does weird things to your perception, and lakes that are so deep we genuinely don't know what's down there. There's also a coastline that stretches over 800 miles with cliffs and beaches and enough isolated coves to hide just about anything. And then there's the human element. California's been a cultural collision point for centuries. You've got indigenous peoples who have lived there for over 13,000 years with their own rich traditions and folklore. The Spanish settlers showed up in the late 1700s, and they brought their legends with them. The gold rush brought prospectors from all over the world, and then Hollywood turned the whole state into this weird, myth-making factory where reality and fiction are very hard to tell apart. Everybody brought their monsters to California, and California just kept them all. I'm going to share 5 of them with you in this video, starting from the oldest recorded sightings all the way up to the most recent ones. And we're going to start with the Dark Watchers. Imagine you're hiking alone in the Santa Lucia Mountains. It's late in the afternoon. It's that weird golden hour time right before sunset where the light gets strange and everything kind of looks samey. You glance up at the ridge and there's a figure there, just standing there. It's tall, like really tall, 10 feet or more, just standing there on the ridgeline, and it looks like it's watching you. You see this and you freeze, you stare back at it for a second, and you can feel your brain processing what in the world you're seeing. But as soon as you blink, it's gone. Congratulations, you may have just encountered a Dark Watcher. The Dark Watchers are one of California's oldest documented cryptids. People have been reported seeing these things for over 13,000 years. The Chumash people, who inhabited central and southern California long before Spanish explorers even knew the Pacific Ocean existed, had stories of shadowy figures that watched from the peaks. When the Spanish settlers did arrive in the 1700s, and they started exploring the coastal mountain ranges, they started seeing the same figures. They called them Los Vigilantes Oscuros, or the Dark Watchers. And the name just stuck, probably because it's wonderfully ominous and also pretty accurate. Now, what makes the Dark Watchers different, though, from other cryptids? It's that their descriptions have stayed incredibly consistent across many cultures and many centuries. Witnesses describe them as tall, dark silhouettes with absolutely zero facial features. Oftentimes, they're wearing what looks like a brimmed hat as well, all the way around. They sometimes have a cloak or like this long duster-style coat. Sometimes they're holding what appears to be a walking stick, and they only seem to show up during twilight hours. They just stand there, completely motionless. And if you ever try to approach one, it just vanishes. 1 second it's there, solid and dark against the sky, and then the next second, nothing. Now, most cryptid legends are built on campfire stories and blurry photographs, but the Dark Watchers have something that most cryptids don't have: serious literary credibility. In 1937, poet Robinson Jeffers, who's a legitimately respected poet, wrote about them in his collection called Such Counsels You Gave to Me and Other Poems. He describes them as, quote, forms that look human to human eyes, but certainly are not human, end quote. Then, in 1938, just a year later, John Steinbeck, the John Steinbeck, the guy who wrote The Grapes of Wrath, he featured the Dark Watchers in his short story called Flight. In that story, a mother warns her son. She says, quote, "When thou comest to the high mountains, if thou seest any of the dark watching men, go not near to them, nor try to speak to them." End quote. Which is wonderfully creepy advice, if you ask me. Don't look at them, don't approach them, don't show any interest at all, just keep walking. They won't bother you if you don't bother them. Steinbeck's son, Thomas, he later claimed that he saw the Dark Watchers multiple times during his childhood, and he eventually co-wrote a book about them with an artist named Benjamin Brode called In Search of the Dark Watchers, where he would interview locals who had claimed to see sightings of them. Modern sightings have continued as well. In the mid-1960s, documented in newspaper archives, a former high school principal was hiking in the Santa Lucias when he spotted a dark figure standing way up top on a rock. He called out to the other hikers that he was around in his group, and by the time everyone had turned to look at what he was pointing at, the figure had vanished. Classic Dark Watcher behavior. So, what are they? The most popular scientific explanation is called a Brocken specter. It's an optical illusion where your shadow gets cast onto a cloud bank and it just looks massive. When the sun's at a particular angle up in the sky and there's fog at just the right altitude, your shadow can look like a giant figure standing amongst the mist. And that's actually a pretty plausible explanation. But here's something that I can't really explain. People have been seeing these figures for 13,000 years. The Chumash saw them, Spanish settlers saw them, hikers today still claim to see them. All in the same mountain range, and they all describe them basically the same way. Tall, dark, featureless, wearing hats or cloaks, and then they disappear when you approach them. That's a really long time for an optical illusion to stay consistent. Tahoe Tessie. Lake Tahoe, if you've ever been, is gorgeous. Well, it's still gorgeous even if you've never been, but it's just one of those places that looks fake because it's too perfect. Crystal clear water surrounded by mountains so blue it almost hurts to look at. It's the largest alpine lake in North America, and it's deep. I'm talking 1,645 feet at its deepest point. That's 231 Shaquille O'Neals, or for those of you on the metric system, that's 305 Daniel Radcliffes. Deep enough that parts of the bottom have never been fully explored. Deep enough that when people die in the lake, their bodies often never resurface because of the water temperature and the pressure. The lake simply holds on to them. It's also allegedly home to a monster. Tahoe Tessie, which is a play on Scotland's Loch Ness monster, Nessie, is Lake Tahoe's resident cryptid, and unlike some creatures on this list, Tessie has a really long history. Sightings that go back over 150 years. One of the earliest documented accounts comes from 1865. Coggin, he's a prominent San Francisco socialite, so he wasn't some random prospector making up stories or something. He reported seeing an enormous serpent-like creature in Lake Tahoe. And when I say enormous, Coggin described this thing as having a head that was 14 feet wide. The body stretched over 600 feet in length. Now, that's almost certainly an exaggeration. People are notoriously bad at estimating size when they're startled. But even if you cut those numbers in half, you're still talking about something huge. The Washoe tribe, indigenous to the Lake Tahoe region, have their own traditions about the lake's mysterious inhabitants. They spoke of water babies that were powerful spiritual entities that lived in the lake, particularly around Cave Rock, which is a sacred formation on the eastern shore. According to Washoe beliefs, these beings had the power to harm people, especially those who spoke about them disrespectfully. There's a taboo around discussing them. In some versions of the folklore, Tahoe Tessie lives in an underwater tunnel system beneath Cave Rock, which is delightfully creepy. I love that. Modern sightings have been pretty consistent too. In the 1950s, off-duty police officers reported seeing a large black hump rise from the water. And this thing was keeping pace with their boat, which was going 60 miles an hour. Whatever they saw in the water that day was matching their speed. Most marine mammals cannot sustain that kind of speed. In June of 1982, 2 Reno Police Department officers, Chris Beebe and Jerry Jones, were off-duty water skiing near Lake Tahoe, just having a fun day, yucking it up, when they observed what they described as an unusually huge creature pass beneath them, and both of them saw this. Both of them agreed that what they saw was enormous and it didn't match anything that they'd recognized. Then we get to July 12 of 1984, probably the most famous modern Tahoe Tessie sighting, and that's because the San Francisco Chronicle ran a story about it. 2 Tahoe City residents, Patsy McKay and Diane Stavrakis, were hiking above the west shore of the lake when they saw something surface. McKay estimated it to be about 17 feet long, and the creature surfaced 3 different times, which gave them a pretty good look. McKay described it as moving, quote, like a small submarine. She says it was smooth, had a mechanical motion to it, and was very deliberate in what it was doing and where it was going. The creature's back appeared to be humped, and it surfaced lazily, like a whale, she says, without any apparent urgency or fear. McKay was very specific about what it wasn't. She was confident that it was not a diver, not a log just bobbing around, and it wasn't a weird ripple or wave pattern. She was adamant that she and Stavrakis had watched a living creature. McKay had grown up around that lake. She knew what logs looked like in the water, and she knew the wake patterns that were made by boats, and this was different. Jump forward to 2005. Mickey Daniels, a longtime Lake Tahoe fisherman and former sheriff's officer with decades of experience, had his own encounter. Daniels had spent years catching massive Mackinaw trout, fish, that can weigh up to 40 pounds or more, so he was intimately familiar with what lived in that lake. One morning, Daniel was out on the lake and it was completely calm. The surface was like glass. There was no wind and there was no other boats nearby that would cause any ripples. Suddenly, a V-shaped wave appeared on the surface. It just appeared out of nowhere, he says, cutting through the calm water. Daniels was certain that the wave did not come from his own boat. He concluded that it had to have been caused by a large animal that was moving quickly right below the surface. In an interview with an LA Times reporter, Daniels said something that really captures the whole Tahoe Tessie phenomenon. He says, quote, "I believe there is something out there, and I've spoken to about 100 different people who have seen it as well. Now what do I do with that? Call them all liars?" End quote. And that's a pretty reasonable point. So, what could Tahoe Tessie actually be? The most plausible scientific explanation was proposed at a UC Davis-sponsored cryptozoology conference in 1984. Researchers suggested that ancient sturgeons could be it. Now, before you roll your eyes, hear me out. Sturgeons are often called living fossils because they've been around largely unchanged for millions of years. And they can reach massive sizes too, 7 to even 20 feet in length and weighing over 1,500 pounds. They're bottom feeders with long serpentine-like bodies and distinctive prehistoric appearances. And they've got these bony plates called scutes that run along their bodies instead of scales. And they can live to be over 100 years old, dude. And it gets crazier in low-light conditions. or when viewed from a distance, or when only part of their body is visible at the surface, a massive sturgeon could actually be mistaken for a lake monster. The theory goes that one or more sturgeons were introduced to Lake Tahoe during late 1800s fish stocking programs. Back then, wildlife management was not scientific exactly. People would throw all kinds of fish into lakes just to see what would thrive. Lake Tahoe was deep enough and cold enough that sturgeons could survive there. They would stay mostly at the bottom, where they'd rarely come to the surface, but occasionally, maybe when the water temperature shift or when the food sources change, they would come up. And when a 15-foot sturgeon surfaces in an alpine lake where people aren't expecting to see anything bigger than a trout, it's going to get a reaction. The sturgeon theory explains a lot, I think. The long serpentine shape, the humped back. Sturgeons have bony plates that create this ridged profile. But that doesn't explain everything, though. It doesn't explain the speed at which this thing was moving at, keeping pace with that boat that was going 60 miles an hour. And it doesn't explain Coggin's description of a head that's 14 feet wide. And it also doesn't address the water babies from Washoe tradition, which actually predate any fish stocking programs. So maybe Tahoe Tessie is an ancient sturgeon. Or maybe it's something else. Lake Tahoe is deep enough and large enough that we haven't explored all of it. At over 1,600 feet deep, in water cold enough to preserve bodies indefinitely, there's a lot of space for something to hide. The Riverside Monster. November 8, 1958. Saturday evening in Riverside, California. Charles Wetzel is driving along North Main Street where it crosses the Santa Ana River. The river's been flooding because of heavy rains and there's water all over the road. Wetzel's taking it slow and he's being very careful not to hydroplane. He just wants to get home safely. And that's when his car radio starts going haywire. It suddenly starts blasting this loud static, and all of the normal station signals become completely unavailable. Wetzel figures this is probably interference from the storm. It's annoying, but what can you do? But then, something emerges from the floodwaters and the underbrush. A creature leaps out directly in front of Wetzel's car, and this thing just doesn't look right. According to Wetzel's later testimony to the police, and yes, he did go straight to the cops, the creature was approximately 6 feet tall with features that don't belong to anything that currently exists. He cited scaly or leaf-like textured skin, and the eyes glowed in the headlights, and the mouth was beak-like. Wetzel told police that it had, quote, a round scarecrow-ish head, like something you'd see on Halloween. It wasn't human, end quote. The creature had 2 extremely long and spindly arms, but where it gets really anatomically bizarre is the legs appear to grow from the sides of its torso, rather than underneath like every terrestrial animal we know about. It's a completely messed up configuration, and the creature was doing a little bit more than just standing there, staring menacingly. It was being aggressive. It started clawing at the windshield, and it was trying to get in, or at least attack the vehicle that Wetzel was in. Now, in the moment, Wetzel panics. He's never seen this thing before, and he doesn't know what it's doing, but he knows it's dangerous. So he floors the accelerator, and the car lurches forward, and it runs directly over the creature. Wetzel could hear distinct sounds like screaming and gurgling, and then he felt and heard the creature scraping underneath the underside of his vehicle as it was being dragged along the road. But Wetzel didn't stop. He just kept driving straight to the nearest police station, and when he gets there, he immediately reports the incident. Police took him seriously enough to examine his car. They did find deep scratches on the hood and the windshield. Something had definitely clawed at Wetzel's car. They also found mysterious smears and residue along the underside consistent with something having been dragged beneath it. There was physical evidence that something had happened. But despite all of these physical traces and bringing police dogs to the scene, they never found the body. Whatever Wetzel hit was gone. The very next night, on November 9, another motorist reported being attacked by, quote, something dark near that same location. We now have 2 attacks 2 nights in a row in the same area. After that, there were no more reported sightings in Riverside. That's a lie. 18 years later, he comes back again. We're now in the 1970s, and 21-inch footprints start showing up in the Santa Ana River Basin. It's the same general area where Wetzel had his encounter. The footprints were believed to possibly belong to a Bigfoot, which is interesting because Wetzel's report didn't sound anything like your typical Bigfoot sighting, but it was the same location. Dr. Cecil Johnson, a biologist professor at Riverside City College, who admittedly is known for some elaborate pranks, allegedly confessed to being the person in a creature costume during Wetzel's encounter. Except, the confession was never officially verified. There's no record of Johnson making a formal statement, and this, quote, confession comes from anonymous sources and secondhand anecdotal accounts. And Johnson himself has never publicly come forward to explain any details. Also, if Johnson was running around in a costume, it doesn't explain almost anything. Like how he made the deep scratches on the hood. How do you explain that? The police documented those scratches. Now, how does a guy in a rubber suit claw metal hard enough to leave marks? Him being in a costume also doesn't explain the residue on the undercarriage of the car. It doesn't explain why police dogs could never track him and find him afterwards. You want to hear something really crazy? In the same year as the original Charles Wetzel encounter in 1958, a completely different Charles Wetzel, who lived in Nebraska at the time, reported an encounter where he saw something that he called a 6-foot-tall brown kangaroo. Now, this was on July 28 of 1958, just a few short months just before the original Wetzel report that we covered. Now, if you ask me, it doesn't sound like the entity that Charles Wetzel in Nebraska saw was the same entity as Charles Wetzel in California saw. I just had to point out that weird coincidence. They have the same names and that happened in the same year. Pretty sus. And they both had sons named Charles as well. There's got to be something to that. Now, this coincidence has never been adequately explained, and it remains one of the strangest footnotes in cryptozoology. So what was the Riverside Monster? The anatomical details, the legs growing from the sides of the torso, its lack of nose and ears, and its beak-like mouth, its glowing eyes, none of those things correspond to anything in the known animal kingdom. Wetzel got a good look at this thing. It was right in his headlights, attacking his car, close enough to see all those details. Nobody knows what it was. There is physical evidence that exists that something happened, and 2 eyewitness detailed accounts. But we have no body, and no definitive explanation. The Riverside Monster remains unresolved. Bigfoot. Okay, so if you clicked on a video about California cryptids and you're surprised that Bigfoot made the list, I genuinely don't know what to tell you. We're here. California has over 1,600 documented Bigfoot sightings, and that number is only second to Washington State, which is right above California. Humboldt County alone accounts for 47 sightings, and about a third of those are in redwood forests where visibility is so limited, you could probably hide a school bus in there. But I'm not here to catalog every single version of I saw something big and hairy in the woods. I'm actually here to talk about one specific incident that changed everything, and that's the Patterson-Gimlin film. It was shot on October 20th of 1967, and even today it remains the single most famous most analyzed, and most controversial piece of alleged cryptid evidence ever captured. It's been scrutinized by anatomists, Hollywood special effects experts, biomechanics specialists, anthropologists, and every skeptic with a YouTube channel. Don't look at me. And after almost 60 years, nobody has definitively proven that it's fake. But also, nobody's definitively proven that it's real either. It exists in this weird limbo that drives both of the believers and the skeptics absolutely crazy. You see, Roger Patterson was a Bigfoot enthusiast. He published a book about it. He was obsessed with finding evidence, and his friend, Bob Gemblin, was an experienced horseman, a cowboy. Basically, he probably just wanted to spend some time outdoors with his buddy. In October of 1967, the two of them are together, and they're up in Bluff Creek in Northern California in the Six Rivers National Forest. Peterson was filming a docudrama about cowboys hunting for Bigfoot. Very low budget, very casual. He brought along his 16mm Kodak camera to capture some footage. Now, it's early in the afternoon this day, sometime around 1:30 p.m. Patterson and Gimlin are riding their horses along the east bank of Bluff Creek. They come around a bend where there's this massive, overturned tree, and suddenly, both of their horses just start losing it. Both of them rear up, and they're clearly terrified at something. Patterson looks up to see what they're so afraid of, and there's a creature. It's standing off in the distance, in the creek bed, and it's covered in dark hair. It's bipedal, and it's just walking along the creek. Patterson has been dreaming about this exact moment for years. So he quickly scrambles off of his panicking horse. He almost falls while doing so, and then he grabs his camera, almost dropping it, and as soon as he gets it ready and puts it up to his eye, he starts filming. His hands are very visibly shaking, and the camera's bouncing all over the place because he's physically running forward, trying to get closer to this thing while also trying not to trip over anything. He manages to capture 59.5 seconds of footage before the creature walks behind some trees and disappears. And in that 59.5 seconds, that would become the most famous piece of cryptid evidence in history. The footage shows a large, hair-covered bipedal creature walking naturally just down the creek bed. The hair appears to be shorter than what Peterson was expecting, and it's described as either silvery brown or darkish reddish brown or black, depending on who you ask. The creature's been nicknamed Patty by enthusiasts, partly because of the visible breasts in the footage, which suggests that it's female. At one point, and this is the moment that's frozen into a million screenshots, the creature turns its head and it looks directly into the camera. And then it quickly turns back and continues walking until it eventually disappears into the trees. Analysts who have studied this footage have noted several weird things, like the creature displays what appears to be like natural muscle definition. You can see the muscles moving under the skin in ways that would be extremely difficult to fake with a costume in the 1960s. And the gait that this thing is walking with, it's very odd. It's not quite human. The stride length is longer than a human's, and the arms swing differently as well. Some experts describe it as a compliant gait, which is when the knees stay bent throughout the entire walking cycle in a way that humans just don't naturally do. But one thing that I found really interesting about all of this, and it's all interesting, I mean, I love this stuff, but this thing in particular stuck out to me. Immediately after that encounter, Patterson and Gimlin photographed and made plaster casts of the footprints that creature left behind. There were clear tracks. They were deep impressions in the mud and the sand around that creek bed. Decades later, biomechanics expert Dr. Jeff Meldrum analyzed one of these original casts with modern technology from today. And he found something that nobody had noticed before, and that is a pressure ridge which indicates midfoot flexibility. That's a trait that's never been recorded in any other primate casting, ever. It's also extremely difficult to fabricate because you need to understand primate biomechanics at a level that most people, even most scientists, simply don't have. The footprints were deeper than the footprints that Patterson and Gimlin made in the same area, even though both of them were wearing heavy boots and carrying heavy equipment. Imagine how much this creature has to weigh for its prints to be that deep. Whoever made those tracks was significantly heavier than any human. The prints also displayed dermal ridges, that's fine skin details analogous to fingerprints, and identical pressure ridge patterns and midfoot flexibilities have shown up in other alleged Bigfoot tracks that have been recovered decades later in completely different locations. For example, the Bossberg footprints from 1969, and recent Pacific Northwest finds as well. They have the same unusual characteristics. The skeptical argument is pretty straightforward. It's a guy in a suit, right? Come on. And honestly, that's fair. People hoax Bigfoot stuff constantly. But professional anatomists and Hollywood special effects artists have tried to recreate what's in the Patterson-Gimlin film, and they can't do it convincingly. Greg Nicotero, who created special effects for The Walking Dead, has said that creating a suit with the kind of natural muscle movement that's visible in the film would be incredibly difficult even with modern technology. And in 1967, with Patterson's budget, dude, impossible. Bob Hieronymus claimed in the late 1990s that he was the one in the suit. But when researchers asked him to demonstrate the gait that was shown in the film, Bob Hieronymus simply could not replicate it. His walk looked nothing like what was in the film. Also, his story changed multiple times. The film has been analyzed frame by frame, and after almost 60 years, people are still arguing about it. Roger Patterson died in 1972 from cancer, and before he died, people would ask him repeatedly if the film was a hoax, and he maintained until his very last breath that what he filmed was genuine. Bob Gimlin is still alive, and he stands by the footage even today, and his story has never changed. Bigfoot sightings continue all across California, and people still report finding tracks today. The debate has not slowed down at all. The Fresno Nightcrawlers. Most cryptids make some sort of biological sense. Big hairy humanoid? Sure, we got apes. Scary lake monster? Yeah, we've got large aquatic animals. Shadow figure on a mountain? Optical illusion, maybe it's a person, right? But the Fresno Nightcrawlers are just legs. That's it. They're a pair of pale, stick-thin legs just walking around. Legs just moving across the ground with this weird, mechanical gait like an animated pair of pants. This is a real cryptid that people have captured on video, and it might be the strangest thing that California has to offer. This whole thing started in November of 2007 in Fresno. A homeowner, identified only as Jose, had recently been robbed, so he installed security cameras around his property. One night, around midnight, Jose's dog just starts losing its mind. It's barking and yapping, and it's very clearly agitated at something. Jose goes outside to check, and he doesn't see anything. There's no signs of raccoons or possums or burglars, thank goodness. There's nothing. Jose goes back inside, and he figures the dog just heard a car backfire or something. Later on, still curious, Jose reviews his security footage to see what set the dog off. And that's when he sees it. A creature walking across his lawn. Maybe 2 to 4 feet tall, and it's white, or at least it's pale colored, and it's shaped like a pair of pants. Just impossibly thin, elongated lower appendages with maybe a very small upper portion, but mostly it just looks like legs. The footage looks real as well, and you could hear the dog barking in the background. A car drives past on the street, its headlight illuminate the area, and it just looks normal until this completely abnormal thing just walks through the frame. Completely unconcerned. It doesn't react to the dog, and it doesn't react to the car. It just keeps walking with this weird, mechanical stride until it finally exits the frame. Most cryptid footage can be explained pretty easily, but how do you explain just legs? The footage is grainy. I mean, it's a home security camera from '07, so we're talking video quality that looks like it was filmed through a screen door in the middle of a sandstorm, but you can clearly make out the shape. It doesn't match any known animal, and there's no head to even look at the camera. Jose shared the footage and it starts circulating online. People were genuinely baffled, and then more sightings came in. In 2011, just 4 years later, security footage from Yosemite National Park, which is a completely different location with actual rangers and security protocols, captured 2 of these things. 2 night crawlers. One was noticeably larger than the other, suggesting that they might travel in pairs or groups. Now, that raises one singular question. No, I'm just kidding. It raises like 1,000 questions, man. Like, how does a creature that's just legs reproduce? Where are the organs? Does it eat? How does it breathe? Some people call the smaller one of this Yosemite footage the juvenile, like there's a parent and child situation, which implies there's a breeding population somewhere, opening even more questions about what they are and how they survive. And the sightings just keep going after that. Similar footage emerged from Poland. Different country, different continent. It's an entirely different ecosystem over there too. And then again in Billings, Montana, somebody there captured something similar on home security, though that footage is described as even blurrier, which is saying something. In at least one case, a deer carcass was discovered near a sighting location. Now, there's no proven connection between the night crawlers and the deer. I mean, deer die all the time in the woods, but it does add just that extra touch of creepiness. And the skeptical explanation is that people are just seeing cranes, birds, specifically the way certain crane species move with their long stilt-like legs. Cranes can look weird when they're walking, especially in low light and on grainy security footage, which, okay, it's not a terrible theory, but cranes have bodies. And even in the worst lighting, even on the grainiest footage, you'd still see something up there, on top of the legs. These things in the footage, literally just legs. The proportions don't match any bird. The movements don't match any bird either. Plus, birds have this kind of cool head bob when they walk. This thing obviously doesn't even have a head to bob. Another theory is that it's some elaborate hoax. Somebody with puppets or special effects creating videos to mess with people or just to get internet famous. And given how many Bigfoot hoaxes exist, that's not entirely unreasonable. People fake cryptid evidence all of the time, but something that bothers me about this is that there's multiple people across multiple locations, countries, continents even, that are capturing similar footage over the span of almost 20 years. That's a lot of coordination, and for what? Jose never made money off of this footage. He didn't try to sell his story to the tabloids. He's not selling Nightcrawler merch as far as I can see. I would buy some though. All he did was just share weird footage from his security camera and then largely disappear from the story. The Yosemite footage came from official park security systems, and you would need access to fake that. And the international sightings would require hoaxers in Poland and Montana who somehow independently decided to create the exact same cryptid. The Fresno Nightcrawlers remain one of California's most baffling cryptids precisely because they don't make any dang sense. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I've got plenty more on the channel for you to binge right now. I'll see you soon.